Attend, O reader, our tale of wonder. Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everyone. Last week we finished up. What did we finish up? Was that the gravity thing? Oh yeah, it was a. Oh no! It was the uh, crystal sphere moves the planet thing. They were like launching an assault on the moon, and like some stuff happened. And then it was like, oh, we'll conclude with their assault on Mars next issue. And I'm like, well, I have no idea when we're getting to that. Although, honestly, I did say that also about Murder Madness, which is one of the things we're reading tonight. Um, so, maybe we will get to it. For context, if you have not listened to the episodes in which Murder Madness has taken place, because it was split into four issues of analog across like I think two seasons of the show. Honestly, uh, in a nutshell, this guy he goes down to Mexico to investigate for I believe the FBI, one of those three letter you know three-letter companies run by the U.S. government because apparently words are escaping me. One of those three-letter agencies is the word I was looking for. Um, and he goes down to Mexico and finds that the essentially that era's version of the cartel is currently producing like hypnotic thralls by the use of some kind of drug. It it's kind of wild, but long story short, our main guy and his entourage have all been dosed through their food, and without the antidote, they're going to slowly lose their minds. Most particularly, the main character's kind of sidekick here, his man on the inside, as it were, has most recently ingested a large quantity of this substance and is going to lose his mind. Um, that's about it in a nutshell. It's standard dashing hero damsel in distress type stuff otherwise. Um, yeah, I don't remember anything else huge. Before we dive into it too far, though, I want to do something that I almost never do normally, and that is call out the fact that you can donate to me. I have a tip jar, and I know it feels very strange for me to call that out, call that out up front, but my contract just came due. Well, it will come due next week. They kind of moved the date up on me instead of it being, uh, sometime in February, so I could have prepared for it properly. And so I'm going to hesitantly entreat that if you have a little money around, I would really appreciate a donation. Anything helps. Anything over, like I think $2 or $3 is processing fees, so anything over that will help me. Um, I think my donation rewards are currently offline, but I'll sort out something. Like you guys will get like a custom channel in the Discord or something. I don't know. I'll come up with something fun. But I would really appreciate the donations. Right now is a very difficult time for the sector in which I work. And you know how normally I say I don't need any money from paper cuts? I've got a day job. My day job is about to end. And so I'm gently going to ask you all that you consider dropping me a donation. For those of you listening to the podcast, I will be linking this tip jar in the show notes. Which, by the way, while I'm on the topic of the show notes for the podcast listener, the show notes tend to have some very useful links in them. First of all, I tend to link to the book we're reading so that if you need something to engage your eyes while you are listening, it's very handy to have the book open. Sometimes I wander off on a tangent, but I kind of rely on the fact that these books are published and 99% of the time accessible for free to act as Erstats transcripts. So if you have concerns about transcription, um, do keep in mind that I link these books in the show notes, and with the exception of this season of the show, which is going to feature a few books that you would have to, go fetch from the library or pay for. Uh, the vast majority of the show has been run on public domain books, and so that's accessible to you. The second thing I'm really going to call out in the show notes here is the Discord. There's a Discord. It's pretty quiet in there. I think just a lot of people who are in there don't have a ton to say. But if you hear me mentioning, oh yeah, I posted a picture of my cat, I'm posting bread, I'm posting this, posting that, that's the Discord I mean. Gariki coming in with donate a kidney. I don't need a kidney yet. You never know these days. Uh, it's part of why I filter my water so aggressively. My family has had trouble with their kidneys before. Um, but yeah, the Discord exists. It is. I have been. I've been doing my best to make it have its own little unique content, so to speak. And I have a good time. I don't know about anybody else. Occasionally, I will hop on the voice channels and start streaming, things that I couldn't put on camera. Ripping DVDs or that sort of thing, or things that I'm not particularly enthused about putting on camera is about perhaps a better way to phrase that. Um, just generally stuff that, like, oh, it'd be really boring if I actually got on my actual stream and did this, but we can just hang out and do this. uh there's also, like I said, in the pictures channel, I'm posting bread probably about once a week, just because that's how much bread I have to make for my sourdough starter. As Gariki mentions, the bread makes me hungry. I'm glad to hear that. It's usually really good bread. I'll I have been known to post recipes. I'll post pictures of cats from time to time. I'll most relevantly to the podcast, I will announce why things are late. There's not really a great way for me to directly address the podcast feed without just, throwing a microphone into Audacity and speaking for a couple moments. And so I use the Discord as a way to announce, oh, I'm late because I'm working on X. I'm late because this is happening in my life, that sort of thing. Or, it's most especially come up when I'm missing streams. I'm like, hi, I'm very tired. Like tonight, I only just have the spoons to do this. I specifically jealously guarded my spoons today so that I would have time to entertain tonight. And yeah, I'd say that's the Discord in a very large nutshell. What else is in the show notes? Oh man. Well, there's a link to the live stream. We talk about this being a live audiobook podcast. Uh, in that this is recorded live to Twitch once a week, Friday nights. Usually we aim for 8 o'clock. I'm somewhere around that time window pretty consistently. Friendly reminder that I am in Pacific time now for the live watcher, so I'm basing my clock off of Pacific time rather than, Central. I've been in Central Mountain and Eastern time interspersed throughout the RV journey, and so I want to make clear I am aiming for 8 o'clock Pacific nowadays. Keep an eye out in the Discord for if that changes. What kind of large nutshell? Peanut, walnut, cashew? Um, I would say a walnut. Well, actually, no. I'd say a cashew because, like, it's got that big fruit around it, and I had a lot to say. You know what I mean? Like, if you think about a walnut, it's about the size of a baseball, a little smaller than a baseball, even. What's like slightly smaller than a baseball? They're about like tennis ball sized, like a whole walnut. It like falls off of a tree and you roll your ankle on it because you're not paying attention. A whole walnut's about the size of a tennis ball, so that's a little small to fit all of the things I've been carrying on about. But if you think about a cashew fruit, they're pretty big. They're like good size. They're like you gotta use two hands to hold a whole cashew fruit. But they're also caustic, so you really shouldn't be doing that without gloves. But, you know. We're in fine form in regards to tangents tonight. Do we have anything else to say? Maybe. We'll find out. Let's read, shall we? Once again, we are concluding the four-part novel Murder Madness by Murray Leinster. Let's dive into chapter 15. The door of the car swung wide, and Ortiz's pale, grim face peered in behind the blue steel barrel of his automatic. He smiled queerly as Jameson, with a grunt of relief, tapped Bell's wrist in a sign to put away his weapon. "Ah, very well," said Ortiz, with the same queer smile upon his face. "One moment." He disappeared. On the instant, there was the thunderous crashing of a weapon. Bell started up, but Jameson thrust him back. Then Ortiz appeared again, with the smoke still trickling from the barrel of his pistol. "I have just done something that I long wished to do," he observed coolly. "I have killed the chauffeur and his companion. You may alight now. I believe we will have half an hour or more. It'll do excellently." He offered his hand to Paula as she stepped out. She seemed to shudder a little as she took it. "I do not blame you for shuddering, senorita. But men who are about to die may indulge in petty spites, and the chauffeur was a favorite with the deputy for whom I am substituting. Like all favorites of despots, he had power to abuse and abused it. I could tell you tales, but I'll refrain." The car had come to a stop in what seemed to be a huge warehouse, and by the sound of water round it, it was either near or built entirely out over the harbor. A large section near the outer end was walled off. Boxes, bales, parcels, and packages of every sort were all heaped about. Bell saw crated air engines lying in a row against one wall. There were a dozen or more of them. Machinery, huge cases of foodstuffs. "The Buenos Aires depot. This was the point of receipt for all the manufactured goods which went to the fazenda of Coyaba, Senor Bell. Since you destroyed that place, it has not been so much used. However, it will serve excellently as a tomb. There are cases of hand grenades yonder. I advise you to carry a certain number with you. The machine guns for the aircraft, with their ammunition, are here." He was hurrying them toward the great walled-off space as he talked, his automatic serving as a pointer when he indicated the various objects. "Now here," he added as he unlocked the door, "is your vessel. The master only brought amphibian planes of late. Those for Cuyaba were assembled, or rather he bought them, you see. Those for Cuyaba were assembled in this little dock and took off from the water. Your destruction up there, Senor Bell, left one quite complete, but undelivered. I think another crate is still in the warehouse. I have been very busy, but if you can fuel and load it before we are attacked." They were in a roofed and walled but floorless shed built into the warehouse itself. Water surged about below them, and on it floated a 5-passenger plane, fully assembled and apparently ready to fly, but brand new and so far unused. "I'll look it over," said Bell briefly. He swung down the catwalk, painted on the wings. Wait, what? Why is the catwalk painted on the wings? That's not a very helpful catwalk. When I'm picturing a catwalk, right? Like, it's a chunk of metal that you stand on that has railings. Why would the catwalk be painted? Is it just like an area of the wing that you are confirmed able to walk on? Did catwalk mean something different at that time? Hang on. We have a dictionary command, maybe. Like, is there a different archaic meaning of catwalk? You inform me. Dictionary. Yeah, Yeah, it's a platform or a narrow walkway. That's not a catwalk if it's just painted onto the wing. That's not a catwalk if it's just painted onto the wing, right? It's just a pathway? I mean, I wouldn't describe that as a catwalk. I would describe it as a pathway, as I just did. Like, that's so weird. Why would they say that he swung down off of a I'm so confused. Like, this is this is a strange and very this is a very specific thing for me to be confused about, but like normally when something is used archaically, it like sticks out to me as like, oh, well, I can see how they got from point A to point B with a word, but something about the description of a catwalk just as like a painted strip is so strange to me. Anyway, he walks on the wing and begins a swift and hasty survey. Soot on the exhaust stacks proved that the motors had been tried, at least. Everything seemed trim and new and glistening in the cabin. The fuel tanks showed the barest trace of fuel. The oil tanks were full to their filling plugs. And he swung back up. I'm taking a chance, of course. If the motors were all right when they were tried, they're probably all right now. They may have been tuned up and may not. I tried the controls; those seem to work. For a new ship, of course, a man would like to go over it carefully, but obviously we're in a hurry. I think that haste would be desirable. Herr Whitkin, no, amigo mio, it was that damned Antonio Calles who listened to us last night. I found pencil marks beside the listening instrument. He must have sat there and eavesdropped upon me many weary hours and scribbled as men do to pass upon the time. He had a tasteful eye for a monogram. I gave all the orders that were needful for you to take off from the flying field. I even went there myself and gave additional orders. And Caius was there. Also, others of the master's subjects. My treason would provoke a terrible revenge from the master, so they sought to prove their loyalty by permitting me to disclose my plan and foil it at its beginning. I would have made the journey with you to the master, but as a prisoner with the tale of my treason written out, I must return and change the orders to the chauffeur when all the master's loyal subjects were waiting at the flying field. But it will soon occur to them what I have done. They will come here, therefore we must hasten. We'll want food and arms, but mostly fuel. We'll get busy. He shut his coat and picked up a hand truck. He rammed it under a drum of gasoline and ran it to the walkway nearest to the floating plane. Coiled against the wall there was a long hose with a funnel at its upper end. In seconds he had the hose end in one of the wing fuel tanks. In seconds more he had popped the funnel into place and was watching the gasoline gurgling down the hose. Paula, watch this. When it's empty, roll the drum away so I can put another in its place. She moved quickly beside it, throwing him a little smile. She sat absorbedly about her task. Jameson arrived with another drum of gas before the first was emptied, and Bell was there with a third while the second still gurgled. They heaped the full drums in place, and Jameson suddenly abandoned his truck to swear wrathfully and tear off his spectacles and fling them against the wall. The bushy eyebrows and beard peeled off. His coat went down. He began to rush loads of foodstuffs, arms, and other objects to a point from which they could be landed on the plane. Ortiz pointed out the things he pantingly demanded. In minutes, it seemed, he was demanding, how much can we take? Any more than that? No more. All the weight we can spare goes for the fuel. See if you can find another hose and funnel and get to work on the other tank. I'm going to rustle up some oil. Didn't they describe the oil tanks as full, like just a few pages ago? Hang on. Wait a minute. They definitely described the oil tanks as full. Yeah, the oil tanks were full to their filling plugs. The fuel tanks were empty. Is he bringing oil? Does this thing leak oil that badly? I mean, I guess it's probably a good idea as like a fallback in case this plane, rattles to pieces or something. How much oil? How much oil was in the fuel mixture of like a 1930s plane? You wouldn't think it would burn that much oil, but also like older engines did wind up burning a lot of the oil in their fuel mixture. I am by no means an expert on aircraft maintenance. Maybe your aircraft is not supposed to burn oil and he's bringing it just in case? I don't know. Let's get back on topic. He came staggering back with heavy drums of it, and a thought struck him. How do we get out? What works the harbor door? Ortiz pointed, smiling. A button, senor, and a motor does the rest. He looked at his watch. I'd better see if my fellow subjects have come. He vanished, smiling his same queer smile. Bell worked frantically. He saw Ortiz coming back, pausing to light a cigarette and taking up a hatchet with which he attacked a packing case. They are outside, senor. They have found the signs of the car entering and now are discussing. He plucked something carefully from a packing box and went leisurely back toward the door. Bell began to load the food and stores into the cabin, sweat streaming down his face. There was a sound of a terrific explosion, and Bell jumped savagely to solid ground. Keep loading. I'll hold them back, he snapped to Jameson. But when he went Oh, wait, that's Bell. Keep loading. I'll hold them back. But when he went pounding to the back of the warehouse, he found Ortiz laughing. A hand grenade, senor, among the subjects of the master. I believe that I'm going mad to take pleasure in such destruction, but since I am to die so shortly, why not go mad if it gives me pleasure? He peered out a tiny hole and aimed his automatic carefully, and it spurted out all 7 shots that were left. The man who poisoned me, I think he's dead. Go back and make ready to leave, Senor Bell, because they will probably try to storm this place soon. Then the police will come, and then it's amusing that I am the one man to whom those enslaved among the city's authorities would look for the master's orders. Bell stared at the small hole. He saw a small horde of people, frantically agitated, milling in the cramped and unattractive little street of Buenos Aires' waterfront. Sheer desperation seemed to impel them, desperation and a frantic fear. They surged forward, and Ortiz flung a hand grenade. Its explosion was terrific, but he had perhaps purposefully flung its sword. One more time. Its explosion was terrific, but he perhaps purposefully flung it short. Bell suddenly saw police uniforms fighting a way through to the front of the crowd, and the source of all this disturbance. Go back. I shall die, Senor Bell. There's nothing else for me to do, but I wish to die with some Latin melodrama. He managed to smile. I will give you 10 minutes more. I can hold off the police themselves for so long, but you must hasten. There are police launches, you know. He held out his hand, and Bell took it. Good luck. You can come along. Bell cut himself off, wrenched by the gaiety on Ortiz's face. That's absurd. I should be murder mad within 3 days. This is a preferable death, I assure you. 10 minutes, no more. And Bell went racing back to find Jameson rolling away the last of the fuel drums and Paula looking anxiously for him. Tank full. Everything's set. What's next? Engines. He swung down and jerked a prop over, again and again until the motor caught. He went plunging to the others. Minutes of frantic. You know what? Maybe I shouldn't improvise. Let's try that again. He swung down and jerked a prop over, again and again until the motor caught. He went plunging to the others, spending minutes until they caught. He throttled them down to the proper warming up, roaring, while the air in the enclosed space grew foul from the fumes of the engine. Oh, I remembered the other thing that I tend to post in the Discord. You know how I've done a couple of table cam embroidery streams? I've been doing a lot of that off stream, and I've been posting progress shots. Other Discords get the final shots of my men's if I like the way they look. But only my Discord that's mentioned in the show notes gets the progress shots as they go along, and some running commentary from me. Similarly, only my Discord gets the crumb of the bread itself. Other Discords get, the outside shots of the bread. The glamour shot, I'll put it in the oven light all nice and in my phone. But only you guys get, after I cut into the bread, what the insides look like. So if you want to join the Igloo's Discord, definitely come join us. Anyway, now that I've plugged the thing I forgot to plug, once more to the warehouse. Ortiz shouted and waved his hand. He was filling his pockets with hand grenades. Bell made a gesture of farewell, and Ortiz seemed to smile as he went back to hold the entrance for a little longer. We're going. Get your guns ready, Jameson, for when the door goes up. He pressed on the button Ortiz had pointed out. There were more explosions and the rattle of firearms from the front of the warehouse. There was a sudden rumble of machinery, and the blank front of the little covered dock rose suddenly. The sunlit waters of Buenos Aires harbor spread out before them. To Bell, who had not looked on sunlight yet that day, the effect was dazzling. He blinked and then saw a fast little launch approaching. There were uniformed figures crowded all about its bows. "All set. I'm gonna give her the gun." "Go to it. We're—" The motors bellowed and drowned out the rest. The plane shuddered and began to move. The sound of explosions from the back of the warehouse was loud and continuous now. Out into the bright sunlight the plane moved, at first heavily, then swiftly. I seem to have lost my page. There we go. Bell saw arms waving wildly in the launch with the uniformed men. Sunlight glittered suddenly on the rifle barrels. Puffs of vapor shot out. Something spat through the wall beside Bell, but the roaring of the motors kept up, and the pounding of the waves against the curved bow of the boat body grew more and more violent. Sweat came out on Bell's face. The ship wasn't lifting. But it did lift. Slowly. Very slowly, carrying every pound with which it could have risen from the water. "Hey, DGP. Glad to see you drop by." It swept past the police launch at 90 miles an hour, but no more than 5 feet above the waves. A big, clumsy tramp flying the Norwegian flag splashed upriver with its propeller half out of water. Bell dared to rise a little so he could bank and dodge it, but he couldn't rise above it. He had one glimpse of blond, astonished beards staring over the stern of the tramp as he swept it by, his wingtips level with its rail and barely 20 feet away. Then he went on and on, out to sea. He began to spiral for height, fully 4 miles offshore, then looked back at the sprawling city. Down by the waterfront, a thick, curling mass of smoke was rising from one spot abutting the water. It swayed aside, and Bell saw the rectangular opening out of which the plane had come. "Ortiz is in there, dying as he planned." Then there was a sudden upheaval of timbers and roof, a colossal burst of smoke. A long time later, the concussion of a vast explosion. There was nothing left where the warehouse had been. Bell looked and swore softly to himself, felt a fresh surge of the hatred he bore to the master and all his works. Then filmy clouds loomed up but a little above the rising plane. Bell shot into them and straightened out for the south. For many long hours the planes floated on southward, high above a gray ocean which seemed deceptively placid beneath a canopy of thin clouds. The motors roared steadily in the main, though once Bell instructed Jameson briefly in the maintenance of a proper course and height, and swung out into the terrific blast of air that swept past the wings. He clung to struts and handholds, and made his way out onto the catwalk to make some fine adjustment on one motor, with 6,000 feet of empty space below the swaying wing. So the catwalk does have, like, struts and grips and railings then. So it is actually a catwalk. It was described as though it was just like a painted-on line earlier. Disregard my confusion about the word catwalk, I guess. "The carburetor's wrong," he explained when he'd closed the cabin window behind him again, and the motor's roar was once more dulled. "It was likely to make a lot of carbon in the cylinders. It's okay now." Paula's hand touched his shyly. He smiled abstractedly at her and went back to the controls. Then the plane kept on steadily. Time and space have become purely relative in these days, in startling verification of Mr. Einstein, and the distance between Buenos Aires and Magellan Strait is great or small, a perilous journey or a mere day's travel, according to the mind and transportation facilities of the voyager. Before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the coast was low and sandy to the westward, and continued sterile and bare for long hours, while the plane hung high against the sky with a following wind, driving it on vastly more swiftly than its own engines could have contrived. It was little before sunset when the character of the shore changed yet again, and the sun was low behind a bank of angry clouds, when the stubby forefinger of rock that Magellan optimistically named the Cape of 11,000 Virgins reached upward from the seemingly placid water. Bell swept lower then, much lower, looking for a landing place. He found it 8 or 9 miles farther on a wide sandy beach, some 3 miles from a lighthouse. The little plane splashed down into the tumbling sea, and, half supported by the waves, half by the lift remaining for its wings, ran for yards upon the hard-packed sand. The landing had been made at late twilight, and Bell moved stiffly when he rose from the pilot's seat. "I'm going over to that lighthouse. There won't be enough men there to be dangerous, and they probably haven't frequent communication with the town anyhow. I'll learn something. You two stay with the plane." Jameson lifted his eyebrows and was about to speak, but looked at Bell's expression and stopped. Leadership is everywhere a matter of emotion and brains together, and though Jameson had his share of brains, he had not Bell's corroding, withering passion of hatred against the master and all who served him gladly. All the way down the coast, Bell had been remembering things that he'd seen of the master's doing. His power was solely that of fear, and the deputies of his selection had been necessarily men who would spread that terror with an unholy zest. The nature of his hold upon his subjects was such that no honorable man would serve him willingly, and for deputies he had need of men even of enthusiasm. His deputies, then, were men who found in the assigned authority of the master full scope for the satisfaction of their own passions. And Bell had seen what those passions had brought about. There was a dull flame of hatred burning in his eyes that would never quite leave until those men were powerless and the master was dead. "You look after the ship and Paula," Bell said impatiently. "All right." Jameson nodded. "What's up, Magnus? You want to come say hi?" Wait, we can see Magnus. Here he is. Hi, bud. You're actually on camera now. The camera's up there, so it can see you. Oh dear. What do I do about this? Poor kitty. He wants to be only an occasional guest star, but he seems to be upgrading to co-host pretty rapidly here. Don't ya? Can you guys even see him? I mean, he's in the shot. You can see Little Void. Can't they? Yeah, they can see ya. Yeah, Magnus. That's another thing. I have spontaneously forgotten that I have Twitch affiliate. If you would like emotes, not limited to, but including an emote of our dear boy Magnus here, um, you could subscribe for a mere $5 whole American, or you could use your Twitch Prime subscription, which you get for free. You know, you're already getting it. You might as well use it on me. I mean, I'm a great free subscription to get. Then you get some wonderful emotes, like, say, one of Magnus and one of Library that you can post when other people's cats show up in the chat. They show up in their streams. You also get this beautiful, beautiful still of me. But I digress. I would not complain if you used your free Prime sub on me. It is an option available to you. I digress, however. Jameson was looking after the ship. Is that where we were before we got distracted by a cute cat? I think that's where we were. Yeah. Jameson nodded, and Paula looked appealingly at Bell, but he'd become a man with an obsession. Perhaps the death of Ortiz had cemented it, but certainly he was unable to think of anything now but the necessity of smashing the ghastly hold of the master upon all the folk he'd entrapped. Subconsciously, perhaps, Bell saw in the triumph of the master a blow to all civilization. Less vaguely, he foresaw an attempt at the extension of the master's rule to his own nation. But when Bell thought of the master, mainly he remembered certain disconnected incidents. The girl at Riviera's luxurious fazenda outside of Rio, who had been ordered to persuade him to be her lover, on penalty of a horrible madness for her infant son if she failed. Of a pale and stricken fazendiero on the Rio Laurencio. Laurencio? How does one pronounce the little, like, C with a line on it? I'm not... I would assume it's like a CH, right? C line under it. Pronunciation Portuguese. A cedilla is a symbol. Yeah, it's a little bit like a cedilla. I think that's what's being encoded there. It's 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 a soft C, like an S rather than a K. Uh, Lorenzo, like that. I see. Well, we've learned something today. Yeah, like in facade, exactly. You don't say facade, and you wouldn't say Lorenco. You would say Lorenzo. Magnus, we don't need to bury the food, I promise. Magnus has once again gotten into the habit of trying to bury his food. It is entirely unnecessary. Yeah, that's right. I said what I said about cod. It's a bad fish. Nah, it's good when you deep fry it. Anyway, Lorenzo, who thought him a deputy and humbly implored the grace of the master for a moody 12-year-old girl. Of a young man who kept his father murder mad in a barred room in his house and waited despairingly for that madness to be meted out upon himself and on his wife and children. Of a white man who had been kept in a cage at Cuyaba with other men. Well, Bell trudged on through the deepening night with his soul a burning flame of hatred. He clambered amid boulders, guided by the tall lighthouse of Cape Possession, with a little white dwelling he'd seen at its base before nightfall. He fell and rose and forced his way on and upward, and at last he was knocking heavily at a trim and newly painted door. Is that better or worse than Darcy spitting her food out on the floor and leaving it there? No, she spits it out and leaves it. Magnus will occasionally take a mouthful of food out of the bowl and then bit onto the floor and then eat it, which is a little odd, but at least he eats it. Darcy just leaves it there. She just kind of ow, bit. Kitty. Library's been pretty good on puke, by the way. He's only puked once or twice in the intervening time between last time I tried to stream, which is really good for him. She might eat one kibble. No, Darcy. Darcy Kidder. You gotta eat the food after you do that. Otherwise, it just sits on the floor. You gotta manually put it back in her bowl so she eats it. Darcy Kidder, you gotta eat the food. I know. Cats are very, idiosyncratic. They have their way of doing things, and you just kind of look at them sometimes and you're like, why are you the way that you are? I do not understand. Also, has that cup worked recently? I think there are no more funny faces in the cup than the last time we got a follow. We had a bunch of people follow recently between streams, and there's no more funny goofy face in the chat in the cup. The whole point of the cup is so that there are little funny goofy faces because I have this still of me making a stupid face. I have a lot of stills of me making stupid faces, to be fair. I'm prone to making silly and stupid faces on camera, but this was really good. I have a really nice pair of headphones on. And I'm listening to music. It's a great picture, but I don't think the cup works anymore. It's supposed to be a bits cup. I think I've had people donate bits twice. Yeah, it's supposed to put little pictures of my face whenever someone follows. And then there's the little snowflake gif that plays whenever someone subscribes. Could someone subscribe to illustrate that maybe? Um the little snowflake gif that plays whenever someone subscribes, that goes into the cup when someone subscribes. And then it does actually have bits. I'm working on a design for my bits, by the way. Can you still do your followers can have a bit emote based on your emotes? Is that a thing? It used to be a thing. I don't know. But I plan on having, like, some fun bit animations for the Bit Cup eventually. It just, it also responds to the rest of my, it responds to a broad majority of my events, or it's supposed to. I don't know if any of those little. I don't know if we have any more little faces. Buddy, now you're trying to put the little bees in the food? I don't think the bee. Oh, bits. Alternate with the two bits. Arf, arf, bark, bark. I think the cup's busted, gang. Hang on. What if I were to um reset the cup? You refresh the cup, please. Because that didn't go through into the cup. I did get the bits and we did get a notification, but it didn't go. Yeah, it's fine. Uh the cup is now loading. The cup is false. The cup also admittedly works a lot better in the. Okay, so the cup does work because we can see all the little faces and subscriptions going into it. Yeah, the Bit Cup does work. I'll have to fuss with that a little bit because, first of all, I think the snowflake GIF is not working. Like, we could visibly see holes in the cup where there are supposed to be little rotating snowflakes, but it does not work. Like, you can see it struggling to work occasionally, like, it'll blink on once every couple seconds. By the way, this is what Magnus was trying to bury. He has a little beehive that has little bees in it because he likes to dig for things. So he has a little beehive with little stuffed bees. There's supposed to be three bees. I don't know where the bees are. There are at least two bees in this room, one of which is in my hand. And so they go in the little beehive, and then he digs them out of there, and it's very enriching. But he decided the bees were hungry. I'm like, buddy, the bees are not hungry. You're just hiding the food from your brother. Better CGI than Twilight. You know what? I haven't watched Twilight in many, many years. I think I watched it when I came out. Like watched it when it came out. I think I read like a good sized chunk of the book, like in a study hall or something when when the movies were coming out, and I was like, this is not as bad as the internet has made me think it is, but it's also only entertaining, not good. Which, don't get me started on the axis of entertaining versus good and how they intersect. It's a whole thing, but something can be entertaining without being Shakespeare, and I will die on that hill. No, not the bees! The bees! So anyway, that book we were reading, this dude was like reasonably inflamed with rage at this antagonist's antics. Anyway, he was so absorbed in his rage that his talk with the lighthouse keeper seemed vague in his memory. Afterward, the keeper was a wizened little Welshman from the Chibet who spoke English with an extraordinary mixture of Spanish intonation and a Cimbrian accent. Bell listened heavily and spoke more heavily still. At the end, he went back to the plane with a spindle-shanked boy with a lantern accompanying him. All settled, he said grimly when Jameson came out into the darkness with a ready revolver to investigate the approaching light. We get a boat from the lighthouse to go to Punta Arenas in. He's a devout member of some particular sect. He's seen enough of the hell Punta Arenas amounts to believe that what I told him of its cause. His wife will look after Paula, and this boy will hitch a team to the plane and haul it out of sight early in the morning. With the help of God, we'll kill Riviera and the master before sunset tomorrow. Chapter 16. But they did not kill the master before nightfall. It wasn't quite practicable. Bell and Jameson started out well before dawn with a favorable wind and tide in the small launch the wizened Welshman placed at their disposal. His air was one of dour piety, but he accepted Bell's offer of money with an obvious relief and criticized his Paraguayan currency with an acid frankness until Jameson produced Argentinian pesos sufficient to pay for the boat 3 times over. I think that Miss Canalejas is safe enough until we come back. The keeper's a goodly man, godly man, even knows we've got money too. She'll be in no danger except of her soul. They might try and save that, you know. Bell did not answer. He could think of nothing but the mission he'd set himself. He tinkered with the engine to make it speed up, and set the sails with infinite care to take every possible advantage of the stiff breeze that blew. Sorry, easily distracted. Stiff breeze that blew, that's where we were. During the day, those sails proved almost as much of a nuisance as a help. The fiendish, sullen willywaws that blow furiously and without warning about the strait required watching, and more than once it was necessary to reef everything and depend on the motor alone. Willywaws, what a good name for, capricious, wiggly breezes. Yeah, sudden violent squalls, says the dictionary. What a good name for that. That's fantastic. That's a fantastic word. That's a real triple pointer if you play Scrabble. That's the type of word you put down on the Scrabble board and people go, "That's not a word. That's not a word. I'm challenging you on that." And you're like, "I don't know. It's a real word. Willywaws. It's a real word and you're about to lose your points for challenging me." You know? Because it's got 3 W's in it too. Like, how many points are you gonna get for that? That's a question for later. Anyway, Bell watched the horizon with smoldering eyes. Jameson watched him almost worriedly. Look here, Bell. You'll get nowhere feeling like I do. I know you've done the master more damage than I have, but you'll just run your head into a trap unless you use your brains. For instance, you didn't talk about communication. Communications, rather. There's a direct telegraph wire from Cape Virgins to Buenos Aires, and there's telephonic communication between the Cape and Punta Arenas. Do you imagine that the plane wasn't seen when it came in the Cape? You imagine the master doesn't know we're here? Bill turned and then frowned darkly. I hadn't thought of it, but I put some hand grenades in the locker there. You damn fool! Stop being bloodthirsty and use your head. You haven't even asked what I've done. I've done something, anyhow. The bundle I chucked in the bow has a couple of sheepsmen's outfits in it. Lots of sheep raised around here, you know. We'll put 'em on before we land, and like a good general, I arranged a method of retreat before we left. Before we left Buenos Aires. There'll be a naval vessel here in 2 or 3 days. She's carrying a party of government scientists. She'll anchor in Punta Arenas harbor and announce a case of some infectious disease on board. No shore leave, you see. Nobody from shore permitted aboard her. She's got 1 or 2 darned good analytical chemists with a damn good laboratory on board her, too. It's a long gamble, but if you think we could get a hold of some of that master's poison, do you see my point? Yes, I see. But you haven't been through what I've been through, what I've done fighting that devil. It's caused men to be deserted after being enslaved. There's this one place, Cuyaba. His face twitched. That place was in his dreams now. That place and others where human beings had watched their bodies go mad and had been carried about, screaming with horror at the crimes those bodies committed. I'm gonna kill the master. That's all. Magnus, excuse me. The press have some questions about your digging habit. Do you have permits? Where are you putting all this quarried stone so nobody notices that you don't have permits? Interesting. Interesting. And what do you plan to do to pay all of the fines from all this digging without permit? He says he asks the man while while he continues to dig. Do you have a plan? Do you have a plan for all this? Do you have your engineer's license? No, yes, I wouldn't expect you to have an engineer's license with beans that small. Okay, well, that's permitted digging, so I guess I'll quit hassling you. Good job. Good job. That's where digs go. Yeah. He settled down to his grim watch for the city. All during the cloudy, overcast day, he strained his eyes ahead. Jameson could make nothing of him. In the end, he had to leave Bell to his moody waiting. Officer, I can explain. Yeah. Do you think he can explain? Explain to the press? The press have questions, you know. His little tail is swishing back and forth. He's like, I have thoughts on this. You're lucky I don't speak English or I'd get you banned right now. The gears are turning. He's deciding whether to lay down. Just remember that that bag behind the record player is not for baby. Yeah, that one. The one you're looking right at right now. Yeah, don't be interacting with that. Just lie down. The bees will not mind if you lie down. Go be a problems goblin elsewhere, huh? There's some interesting things through the door that you could go do. Yeah, you are not contained to the room right now. You could go places, do things. Anyway. The morning passed, and midday, and a long afternoon. 3 times Bell came restlessly back to the engine and tried to coax more speed out of it, but to no avail. When darkness fell, the town was still not in sight. They kept on then, steering by the stars with the motor putting sturdily away in the stern. The water splashed and washed about them. The little boat rose and fell and rose again. That's the town, said Bell grimly. It was 11 at night, or even later. Lights began to appear very far away, dancing mirage-like on the edge of the water. They grew nearer with an almost infinite slowness. 2 wide bands of many lights, with a darker space in which a few much brighter lights showed clearly. Presently, a single red light appeared, the Punta Arenas harbor light 25 feet up on an iron pole. They passed it. Now, Bell. I'm so frustrated with you. I lost my accent for a second. It's time you showed some sense now. We're going to find out some big things before we get reckless. This town isn't a big one, but it's always a hell on earth. No extradition out of here. It's full of wanted men, dying now from when the old days, when all the ships passed the straits before the Panama Canal opened up, but still it ought to be a hell on earth despite that. We're going to put on these sheepsmen's outfits, put up some low-caste sailors and sheepsmen's hotel on the shore, find out what's what in the morning, if you like. In the morning, I'm going to settle up with the master. They found a small and filthy hotel in a still filthier street, where the houses were alternately black and silent and empty, or filled with a squalid hilarity most seaport towns can somehow manage to support. Ugh, going to pieces. The street lamps were white and cold. The dirt and squalor showed more plainly by their light. There were sailors from a few ships in the harbor, and women so haggard and bedraggled that shrill laughter and lavish endearments remained their only allure. And Bell and Jameson plodded to the reeking place in which a half-drunk sheepsman pointed, and there Bell sat grimly in the vermin-infested room, while Jameson, swearing wryly, went out. Yeah, alternately. Good catch, Gary. I got a bad habit of picking books that have people's names in them. We had the Colors of Space a while back with Kebo. Or Kebo and Kebo. Now we've got houses that are mentioning alternate. Anyway, he came back much later. His breath was strong of bad whiskey. He looked like a man who feels that a bath would be very desirable. Looked like a man who felt unclean. Give me a cigarette. I found out most of what we want to know. Bell gave him a cigarette and waited.
Good thing you stayed behind. I want to vomit. Why people go in hellholes like this for fun? I was very drunk and very amorous. Picked up a woman, fed her liquor, young too. Oh, she got crying drunk and told me everything she knew. I gave her money and left. Punta Arenas is the master's body and soul. One could have guessed this. Nothing like it is. Every living creature, man, woman, and child, been fed that devilish poison of his. Keepers of the dives go fawn to the local officials for the antidote. The jefe politico is driven in his marriage to be cured when red spots form before his eyes. The damn place, it's full of suicides and women's, and oh my god, it's horrible. Friendly reminder, this seems like a good a time as any to bring up the disclaimer. These were written in the 1930s. I present them because they have more good than bad, but please remember when they were written. They're quite old. Anyway, a humming, buzzing noise set up off the night somewhere. It kept up for a long time, throttled down, and then seemed to grow louder, changing in pitch, then dwindling as if in the far, far distance. That's one of the master's planes now, no doubt, going off on some errand for him. He used this place practically as an experiment station. The human beings here are his guinea pigs. The deputies get a standardized form of the stuff, but he's got it worked out in different doses so he can make a man go mad now as if he chooses instead after a delay. I don't know how, and well, the master... He checked himself sharply as there were shuffling footsteps in the hall outside. A timid little tap on the door. Jameson opened it while Bell dropped one hand inconspicuously to a weapon inside his shapeless clothing. The toothless and filthy old man who kept the hotel beamed in at them. Señores, son de porvenir, no es verdad? Jameson hiccoughed as one who has been out and drunk and ought to do. No, viejo. Somos de la estancia del señor Rubio, vaya. That was very hard to do in that accent. The old man seemed to mourn that they didn't come from the sheep ranches about the Porvenir Bay, but he produced a bottle with a shaking hand, still beaming. Tengo muchos amigos en Porvenir. Que esta botella. Dímela, mumbled Jameson. He reached out his hand. No más que poquito, said the old man, beaming but anxious as Jameson tilted it to his lips. Es whisky de dientes. So, translation here. As you might be able to guess here, old man wants to know if they live, if they're from Porvenir, and then Jameson's like, no, we're from the state of Senor Rubio. Please leave. And the old man's like, oh, well, that sucks. And then he goes, I've got a lot of friends in Porvenir, in this bottle. And Jameson's like, give me that. And the old man's like, don't drink it. Only drink a little bit. It's whiskey of the gentleman. Roughly is what he's saying there. I mean, you could probably have put that together from context, but, nice to know. Anyway, he beamed upon Bell, and Bell swallowed a spoonful and seemed to swallow vastly more. He lay back lazily while Jameson, in the part of a tipsy sheepherder, bullied the old man amiably and eventually chased him out. You amused? Asked Jameson sardonically when there were no more sounds outside. Because I said you didn't want to meet the young senorita who loved you when she saw you downstairs? Well, Bell, if you used your brain, you didn't swallow any of that stuff. Bell started up, and Jameson caught him by the shoulder. I'm not sure, of course not. But it's pretty funny it's damned funny for a Spanish hotel keeper to give something for nothing, even when he just wanted to gossip about his friends. Here, drink the water. It looks vile enough to take the place of a mustard. Next morning, the hotel keeper beamed upon them both as they went out of the place. A slatternly, dark-haired girl who leaned on his shoulder smiled invitingly at Bell, and Bell, in his character of a loutish sheepman from one of the ranches that dot the shores of the strait, grinned awkwardly back. But he went on with Jameson. We separate. We want to find where the master lives mostly, then we want to find the laboratory where his stuff is mixed. We don't want to do anything until that's settled. After all, the trade has something to say. Bell nodded indifferently and began to wander idly about the streets, turning here and there as if moved by nothing more than the vaguest curiosity. But gradually he was working through the sections in which the larger buildings stood. Concrete structures, astonishingly modern, dotted the business section, but none of them had the air that would surround a place where a man with the power of life or death would be. In a town the size of Punta Arenas, there would be unmistakable evidences about the master's residence, even if it were only that who passed it did so hurriedly and with a tinge of fear. There were prosperous men in plenty on the streets, mingled with the deserting sailors, stockmen, and farmers from villages along the strait, and even a few grimy men who looked like miners. But there is a lignite mine not far from the city, and a narrow-gauge railroad running to it. Of the prosperous-seeming men, however, Bell picked out one here and there toward whom all passers-by adopted a manner of cringing respect. Bell lounged against a pole and studied them thoughtfully. Men with an air of unamused and careless scorn, which only men with unlimited power may adopt. He saw one grossly fat man with hard and cruel eyes. The uniformed policeman drove all traffic abjectly out of the way of his carriage, and he stood with lifted hat until he had passed. The fat man gave not even the faintest sign of acknowledgment. I wonder if that's the master. And then a passer-by dodged quickly past his shoulder, brushing against him, and waited humbly in the street. Bell turned. A party of men were taking up nearly all the sidewalk. There were half a dozen of them in all, and nearly in the middle it was the bulky, immaculate, pigmented Ribiera. Bell stiffened, but to move beyond clearing the way would attract attention. He backed clumsily off the curbing as if making way, and Ribiera caught the look of his face. Bell's hand drifted near his hidden weapon, but Ribiera neither looked surprised nor alarmed. He halted and chuckled. "Ah, the Signor Bell." Bell said nothing, looking as stupid as possible, merely because there was nothing else to do. Do not deny my acquaintance. I advise you to go and look at the view over the harbor. Good day, Signor Bell." Laughing, he went off along the street, and Bell felt a cold horror creeping over him as he realized what Ribiera might mean. Ribiera had entirely too much against him to greet him only, in a town where even the dogs dared not to bark without the master's express command. He had guards with him, men who would have shot Bell down at a nod from Ribiera. Bell burst into a mad run for the waterfront. When the bay spread out before his eyes, he saw what Ribiera meant, and something seemed to snap in his brain. The plane in which he and Jameson and Paula had escaped in was floating out in the harbor. It was unmistakable. A larger, bulkier seaplane floated beside it. The buzzing in the air the night before, it was the arrival of a plane that had been telephoned from Cape Virgins. Through a glass, perhaps, even its alighting had been watched, and a big seaplane had gone out to bring it back. Footprints on the sand would obviously lead toward the lighthouse. There'd be plenty of men to storm that, if necessary, to take the three fugitives, but they only would have found Paula. It was quite possible that the plane had only been sent for after Bell and Jameson had been seen to land in Punta Arenas, and Paula, in the master's hands, would explain Ribiera's amusement perfectly. Bell found Jameson looking unhurriedly for him, and Jameson glanced at his utterly white face and said softly, "We want to get to be, or rather, this is Jameson. We want to get to be where we can't see the talk. There's the L to pay. It's no use hiding. Paula, hide anyway." He fairly thrust Bell into an alleyway between two houses and thrust two rounded objects beneath his loose-fitting coat. "Two grenades. I've got two more. The boat we came in is taken. So's the plane. And there's a sign in English posted where we tied it up. The sign says, 'The Signores Bell and Jameson may recover their boat on an application to the master, and may also receive news of a late traveling companion from him.'" "We've known," Bell told him, and amazingly found it possible to smile faintly. "Ribiera met me on the street, spoke to me, laughed, and went on." Jameson stared. Bell's manner was almost entirely normal again. Then Jameson shrugged.
The sense of what you're saying is that we're licked. Let's go then to see the master. I confess I feel some curiosity to know just what he's like. Bell was smiling. Being in an entirely abnormal state, he had a curious certitude of the proper course to adopt. He went up to a policeman and said, politely, in Spanish, I, uh, I am desired to report to the master himself. Will you direct me? The policeman abased himself instantly, and trotted with them as a guide. And Bell walked naturally now, with his head up and his shoulders back, smoked leisurely as he went, and the policeman's abasement became abject. All who walked with that air of amused superiority in Punta Arenas were high in the service of the master. Arnel Quendi joining us for a raid. Welcome, welcome, raiders, to the igloo. My name is Glacier Nestor. We are currently polishing off a issue of Astounding Stories of Super Science. This one released in August of 1930. Uh, I'm not snowed in, actually. I'm out in an undisclosed location where it does not snow any longer. Uh, how was your stream though, RNL? You were playing Irresistible Mistakes. Is that a visual novel? Is that a game? Inform me. How did how did it go? Was it a good time? Was it a good read? Was it a good play? Uh, Yeah, I've really been enjoying the move to this place. I moved in with my partner Raz, and it's very exciting. Uh, Raiders, we are currently in the middle of my book reading show, Paper Cuts, where we read a book every Friday evening. Um, like I said, we're currently working our way through Astounding Stories from August of 1930. We're finishing up a serialized novel, that the name of which escapes me. Give me just a sec. Table of contents. Murder Madness is the name of it. Uh, it's been good. It's been a really good time to read this again. In a nutshell, what I do around here, since you're coming from RNL, it'll be very familiar. I read aloud uh, to camera, and I have a great time doing it. On Tuesday nights, I do things other than this, but Tuesday night streams have been a little fewer and farther between because I've been very busy trying to land a new contract as mine is coming to end of date next week, and that's a very stressful thing. So, only so many spoons to go around. Oh, the breakup happened, but they'll get back together in the third act. Oh, but it's how they get back together is the fun part. I don't read a lot of romance, but I know watching them figure out that they should get back together and then how they get back together. That's the good part. It's the details. Glad you're enjoying it though. While I'm on a tangent, I was gonna just start rattling about something. Oh yeah, but Tuesday night streams, we should be those should be picking back up relatively soon. I'm in the process of wrangling. I have a second camera lying around behind me here, and I need to figure out how to get it integrated into my stream setup so that we can have table cam again. So then we can do some embroidering streams. I have some men's I would like to finish up, and that'll be fun. We might start doing more solo tabletop games again. That'll be really fun. We might just play some good old fashioned video games. But for now, tonight we are reading books, and we've been reading a good one. Honestly, as much as this really is somewhat paint by numbers, it's not bad. You know, sometimes you get that type of thing in these old pulp magazines. That's what I was going to say. Last thing before we get back to the book here. Arnell is a fellow member of the Codex here. Codex, for context, is a group of reading streamers. We all just kind of, web ring promote each other. We raid into each other when we can. We is book club. We should maybe work on book club again, because book club, for context, is like the one big group project that the Codex tends to come together for. We all pick a book and we say, all right, we're gonna read this book, and then we're gonna do like English class, discussion on it on stream, and it's really fun. And now that I am not driving the RV every, it really felt like every time I was driving the RV was when book club was. And so now that I'm not driving the RV, now that I am in a standard apartment, I should have a good shot at making those. And I'm hoping that they can get back together. Maybe I should take the initiative on that, pick something fun for us all to potentially read. But I digress. Codex. We all read. If you like what I do here, if you like what RNL does, you're going to like the rest of us. If you want a list of everyone who's in Codex, I believe now it's a Twitch team that I'm a part of, so that'll be down below me. But that's it in a nutshell. We're basically all just like, we all read. We might as well talk to each other. It's a good time. Speaking of reading, let's get back to that, shall we? Bell was smiling. Being in an entirely abnormal state, he had a curious certitude of the proper course to adopt. He went up to a policeman and said politely the thing that we've already read. RNL is on board for me to suggest a book. I have several books that would be really interesting, honestly. Looking back here at my bookshelf, I got a few that'd be really interesting. A few that would be pretty accessible from the library. You know, what'd be really great is there was this solar punk novel I read recently, um, A Prayer for the Crown Shy, and it's really great. And I actually reached out to the author, and I haven't gotten anything back from them yet, and I have my fingers crossed. But A Prayer for the Crown Shy would actually be a really fun one. I would love to see what the Codex as a group thinks of not only that story, but like the implied world building that goes on in that story. And I want to hear some people's takes on solar punk at large, because I'm a big fan of the genre. But I want to hear what you all think. Remind me after stream if I don't think of it. I will post in the Discord about it. Anyway, policeman abased himself, amused superiority. That's where we were. Obviously, the two men in these dejected clothes must also be high in the service of the master, and had adopted their disguise for purposes into which a mere policeman and the slave of the master should not dare inquire. Let me type that. Prayer for the crown. Wait, no. I got the title of the first book and the second book mixed up in my head. It's A Psalm for the Wild Built. The sequel, for context, is A Prayer for the Crown Shy. They're both by... Hang on. Here, let me look. Becky Chambers. Becky Chambers is who wrote that. Both of those. They're both really fun. They're really like light. They're really small novellas. It's a pretty quick read, so I think that would make it relatively accessible for the group. I know we have a bad habit of choosing books that you can get through in a month. But it's a little bit of a stretch if you're trying to read it on stream. Which this one wouldn't be one we could read on the stream. It's obviously not public domain. But it's been getting a lot of publicity recently. Broadly, I think solar punk as a genre has really attracted a lot of eyes. It's very satisfying conceptually. It is available from your local library. Can confirm. That's actually how I read it. I bought the sequel because I liked the first book that much. But I heartily suggest it. There are at least one solar punk book coming up, but to do that, we gotta stay on target here and actually finish the issue of Astounding Stories we're reading. Jameson was rather grim and still. Jameson thought he was walking to his death,
But Belle smiled peculiarly and talked almost gaily, and as Jameson thought, almost irrationally. They came to a house set in a fairly spacious lawn behind a rather high wall. There were greenhouses behind it, and there were flowers growing as well as any flowers can be expected. Oh, Raz detected.
Hello, Internet. I'm back from the siren.
You have escaped. Hello.
No.
We'll be
Enjoy your
around.
book.
We'll be around at intermission. Love you.
Love you too.
Anyway, where were we? Greenhouses, flowers. It was an extraordinarily cheerful dwelling to be found in Punta Arenas, but the shuddering fear with which the little policeman removed his hat as he entered the gateway was instructive. The chat says hello, by the way. The chat says hello. Raz also says hello. Confronted by the 4 other policemen on guard inside the gate. "Estos señores," began the abject one. "Take us to the master," commanded Bell in a species of amused and superior scorn. "It is required, señor," said the leader of the 4 on guard very respectfully. "It is required that none enter without being searched for weapons." Bell laughed. "Does the master manage things so? Now where I am deputy, no man would dare to think of a weapon to be used against me. If it is the master's rule, though." The policeman cringed at this. Bell scornfully thrust an automatic out. "Take it, and go and tell the master that Senores Bell and Jameson await his pleasure, and they've given up their weapons." The policeman scuttled toward the house. Bell smiled at his cigarette. "You know, Bell, I'd hate to learn to play poker with you. I'm not bluffing, not altogether. I've got a 4-card flush with a draw to come." Almost instantly, the policeman returned, more abject still. He'd stammered out Bell's message just as it was given to him, and the slaves of the master did not usually disobey orders, especially orders designed to prevent any danger of a doomed man or woman trying to assassinate the master before their madness was complete. Bell and Jameson were received by a liveried servants in utter silence and conducted through a long passageway too long to have been contained entirely in the house as seen from the front. Indeed, they came out into a great open greenhouse in which the smell of flowers was heavy. There were flowers everywhere, and a benign, small old man with a snowy beard and hair sat at a desk as if chatting of amicable trivialities with the frock-coated men who stood about him. The white-haired old man lifted a blossom delicately to his nostrils and inhaled its perfume with a sensitive delight. He looked up and smiled benignly upon the 2. It was then that Jameson got a shock surpassing all the rest. Bell's hands were writhing at the ends of his wrists, writhing as if they were utterly beyond his control, and as if they were longing to rend and tear. And Bell suddenly looked down at them. His expression was that of a man who sees cobras at the end of his arms. Ooh, he's losing it, gang. He's losing it. They got him. So for context, if you don't quite recall here, the master has generated a substance that slowly drives people to madness, and Bell has been exposed, and without the antidote, is in fact slowly going mad. And one of the symptoms is writhing hands. So he's looking down at those writhing hands and being like, "No, not this soon. It can't be." Let us dive into chapter 17, shall we? There was a long pause. Bell was very calm, to his credit. He seemed to tear his eyes from the writhing hands that were peculiarly sensitive, as if under the control of an intelligence alien to his own. "I believe that the master wishes to speak to me." With an apparent tremendous effort of will, he thrust his hands into his pockets. Jameson cursed softly. Bell had taken the direction of things entirely out of his hands. It only remained to play up. To be sure, said a mild, benevolent voice. The man with the snowy beard regarded Bell exactly in the fashion of an elderly philanthropist. I am the master, Senor Bell. You've interested me greatly. I've grown to have a great admiration for you, even. Will you be seated? Your companion also pleases me. I would like, and the mild brown eyes beamed at him, I would like to have your friendship, Senor Bell. Pull out a chair for me, Jameson. I'd like to have a cigarette, said Bell in a strained voice. Jameson cursed under his breath and put a chair behind Bell, striking a cigarette between his lips. He held a match, though his hand shook. You might sit down, too. From the manner of the master, I imagine this conversation will take some time. He inhaled deeply of his cigarette and faced the little man again, and the master looked so benevolent that he seemed absolutely cherubic, and there was absolutely no sign of anything but the utmost saintliness about him. His eyes were clear and mild. His complexion was fresh and translucent. The wrinkles that showed upon his face were those of an amiable and serene soul filled with benevolence and charity. He looked like one of those irritatingly optimistic old gentlemen who habitually carry small coins and stray bits of candy in their pockets for such small children as they may converse with under the smiling eyes of nurses. Ah, Signor Bell, you do cause me to admire you. May I see your hands again? Bell held them out. He seemed to have conquered their writhing to some extent, but he couldn't hold them quite still. Sweat stood out on his forehead. He thrust them abruptly out of sight again. Sad, very sad. He sighed faintly and laid down the rose that he was playing with. His fingers caressed the soft petals delicately. Fortunately, it's not yet too late for me to relieve the strain under which you labor, senor. May I send for a certain medicine which will dispose of those symptoms in a very short time? We'll talk first. I want to hear what you have to say. The master nodded, his fingers touching the rose petals as if in a sensitive pleasure in their texture. Always courageous. I admire it while I combat it, but the Signor Jameson, well... Jameson had been looking fascinatedly at his own hands, opening and closing the fingers with a savage abruptness. They obeyed him, though they trembled. I didn't drink the damn stuff the hotel keeper brought us last night. Bell did, and I... Now, wait a minute, Jameson. Let's talk to the master for a while. I swore, sir, that I'd kill you. I've seen what your devilish poison does in the hands of men you've chosen to distribute it. I've seen... He swallowed and said harshly, I've seen enough to make me desire nothing so much as to see you roast in hell, but you want to talk to me. Go ahead. The master beamed at him, and then glanced about at the frock-coated men who had been attending him. Bell glanced at them. Ribiera was there, chuckling. I told you, Tio mio, that he would not be so polite. You can do nothing with him. Better have him shot. Francia of Paraguay nodded amusedly to Bell as their eyes met, but the master shook his really rather beautiful head. An old man can be good to look at, and with a saintly aureole of snow-white hair and the patriarchal white beard, the master was the picture of benign and beautiful old age. Ah, you do not understand. The more Senor Bell shows his courage, hijo mio, the more we must persuade him. He turned to Bell. I realize that there are hardships connected with the administration of my power, senor. It is inevitable. But the Latin races of the continent, which is now nearly mine, require strong handling. They require a strong man to lead them. They're comfortably only under despotism, you see. The task I've chosen for you is different entirely. Los Americanos del Norte will not respond to the treatment which is necessary for those del Sur. Or Sud, rather. Their governments, their traditions, they're entirely unlike ours. If you become my deputy and viceroy for all your nation, well, you shall rule as you will. A benevolent yet strong rule is needed for your people. It may even be that I permit it, that the democratic institutions of your nation may continue if you so desire. I'm offering you, senor, the position of an absolute ruler of your nation. You may interfere with the present government not at all, if you so choose, provided only that my own commands are obeyed when relayed through you. I chose you because you have courage and resourcefulness, because you have the young cleverness which will understand your nation and cope with it. Bell inhaled deeply at this. In other words, you're saying indirectly that you'll offer me a chance to be the sort of ruler Americans will submit to without much fuss, because you think if one of Ribiera's stamp would drive them to rebellion. The fine dark eyes twinkled in the master's face. You have much virtue, senor. My nephew, though he is to be my successor, has a weakness for a pretty face. Would you prefer that I give him the task of subduing your nature? He might try it. He'd be dead within a week. The master laughed softly at this. I like you, senor. I do like you indeed. I've not been so defied since another Americano del Norte defied me in the same room, but, well, he had not your resource. He had been enslaved with much less difficulty than yourself. I don't remember quite what happened to him. He was taken, master, said a fat man with hard eyes, obsequiously. Obsequiously? Yet another word I've only seen written. It's, in deference to a ruler, essentially. He was taken in Bolivia. It was the man whom Belle had seen earlier that morning in the carriage. You gave him to me. He had insulted me when I ordered him sent to you. I had him killed, but he was very obstinate. Ah, yes. You told me the details, the master said meditatively. He seemed to recall small facts in benevolent retrospection. But you, Signor Bell, I have need of you. In fact, I shall insist upon your friendship. Therefore, and he beamed upon Bell, I give you back the Senorita Canalejas. He shook his head reproachfully at the utterly grim look in Bell's eyes. I shall give you one single portion of the antidote to the medicine which makes your hands behave so badly. You may take it when you please. The Signor Jameson I shall keep and enslave. I do not think he'll be as obstinate as you are, but he has excellent qualities. If you prove obdurate, I may yet persuade him to undertake certain tasks for me, but you and the Senorita Canalejas are free. Your boat has been reprovisioned and provided with fuel. You may go from here where you will. Ribiera snarled at this. Dio mio, you promised me. Your will in many things, said the master gently, but not in all. Remember that you have much to learn, hijo mio. I have taught you to prepare my little medicine, it's true. That's so you can take my place if my age's infirmity shall carry me away. The master folded his hands with the air of pious resignation. But you must learn policy. The Senorita Canalejas belongs to the Signor Bell. Jameson was staring now, but Bell's eyes had narrowed to mere slits. You see, I desire your friendship. You may go where you will. You may take the Senorita Canalejas with you. You have enough of the antidote to my little medicine to keep you sane for perhaps a week. In 1 week you may go far with her. You may do many things, but you cannot find a place of safety for her. I still have a little power, senor. If you take her with you, your hands will writhe again. Your body will become uncontrollable. Your eyes, staring and horror-struck, will observe your own hands rending her. While your brain is yet sane, you'll see this body of yours, which now desires her so ardently, tearing and crushing that delicate figure, gouging out her eyes, spattering her tender flesh, destroying her. Have you ever seen what a man who has taken my little medicine does to a human being at his mercy? The figures about the master were particularly tense. The fat man with the hard eyes laughed, suddenly. It was a horrible laugh. Francia of Paraguay took out his handkerchief and delicately wiped his lips. He was smiling. Ribiera looked at Bell's face and chuckled. His whole gross figure shook with his amusement. And of course, if you prefer to end things a little bit more cleanly, if you prefer to leave her here, well, my nephew knows little expedients to reduce her will to compliance. You recall Yagué, among others. Bell's face was a white mask of horror and fury. He tried to speak and failed. He raised his hand to his throat and it tore at the flesh insanely. Let me see her, croaked Bell as if strangling. Jameson stiffened. Bell seemed to be trying to get his hands into his pockets. They were apparently uncontrollable. He thrust them under his coat as there was a stirring at the door. Paula was brought in, as if she had been waiting. She was entirely colorless, but she smiled at Bell. She came quickly to his side. I heard. We will go together, Charles. If there's a week in which we can be together, it'll be so much happiness. And when you are, well, the master's victim, we will let the little boat sink and sink with it. I do not wish to live without you, Charles, and you do not wish to live as a slave. Bell gave utterance to a sudden laugh that was like a bark. His hands came out from under his coat. Dangling from each one was a small, pear-shaped globule of metal. A staff projected upward from each one, and he held those staves in his writhing hands. About each wrist was a tiny loop of cord that went down to a pin at the base of the staffs. Close to me, Paula, he said coldly. She clung to his arm, and he moved forward with half a dozen revolver muzzles pointed at his chest. If one of you damn fools fires, I'll let go. When I let go, well, these are Mills grenades. They go off in 3 seconds after they leave the hand. So hold still. There was a terrible, frozen silence. Then a movement from behind Bell. Jameson rose with a grunt. Some day, Bell, I'll be on to all your curves. This is the best one yet, but you're likely to let go at any second, are you? Like hell. I drank some of your poison, he snarled at the master. Yes, I was fool enough to do it, but I took what measures any man will take who finds out he swallowed poison. Got it out of my stomach at once. And if you or one of these deputies tries to move... Ribiera had blanched to a pasty gray. The master was frozen, but Bell saw Ribiera's eyes move in swift calculation. There was a solid wall behind the master. It seemed as if the greenhouse were a sort of passageway between two larger structures. There was a door almost immediately behind Ribiera. Ribiera glanced right and then left, and he flung himself through that door. He knew the secret of the master's power. He was the master's appointed successor. If the master and all his deputies died, Ribiera, well... Bell, however, snapped into action like a bent spring released. His arm shot forward. A grenade went hurtling through the door which through Ribiera had fled. There was an instantaneous, terrific explosion. The solid wall shook and shivered, with a vast deliberation collapsed. The greenhouse was full of crushed plaster dust. Panes of glass shivered, but Bell was upon the master. He had struck the little man down and stood over him, his remaining automatic replacing the grenade he'd thrown. Ribiera's dead, and if I'm shot, the master dies too, and you all go bad. Stand back. The deputies stood frozen. I think I take a hand now. I'll pick him up, Bell. Right, I've got him, with a grenade hanging down his back. If he jerks away from me or I from him, it'll blow his spine to bits. Hold him so. He went coolly to where he could look over the heap of the collapsed wall. He saw a bundle of torn clothing that had been a man. It was flung against a cracked and tottering chimney. Right, Ribiera's dead, all right. He turned to the deputies, whose revolvers were still in their hands. The master's carriage, please. To the door. You may accompany us if you please, but in other carriages. I'm working for the release of all the master's slaves, you among them if you so choose. But you can see very easily there's no hope of the release of the master without the meeting of my terms. The master spoke, softly and mildly without fear. It is my order that the Signor Bell is to be obeyed. I shall return. You have no fear of my death. Fetch my carriage. A man went stiffly, half paralyzed with terror, to where chattering, scared servants were grouped in the awful fear that came upon the slaves of the master at any threat to his rule. But Bell and Paula and Jameson went slowly and cautiously, though they held the whip hand, to the entrance door of the house and out to the entrance gate. A carriage was already before the door when they reached it, and others were drawing up in a line behind it. Get in, down to the waterfront. He turned to the group of frock-coated, stricken men who had followed. Some of you men had better go on ahead and warn the police, and the public generally, about the certainty of the master's death if any attempt is made to rescue him. Francia of Paraguay summoned a swagger and raised his hand to the second carriage. It drew in to the curb. I will attend to it, Signor Bell. Ah, when I think that I once raised my revolver to shoot you and refrained, well, he drove off swiftly. Bell's eyes were glowing. He got into the carriage, and such a procession drove through the streets of Punta Arenas as is rarely moved through the streets of any city in the world. The long line of carriages moved at a funereal pace amid a surging, terrified mob. The master beamed placidly as he looked out over white, starkly agonized faces. Some of the people groaned audibly. A few cursed the master in their despair. More, however, cursed Bell, not daring to strike or fire on him, but he would have been torn to bits if he had stepped from the carriage for an instant. Bell, considering that I'm prepared to be blown apart on 3 seconds' notice, it's peculiar that this mob is getting to me. The master's eyes twinkled benignly. He seemed totally insensible to the fear. You need not be afraid. They will not touch you unless I order them. Jameson stared down at the little man whose collar he held firmly, with a Mills grenade dangling at the base of his neck. I wouldn't order them attack if I was you. I haven't got Bell's brains, but I've got just as much dislike for you as he has. They came to the harbor, where Bell spoke again. The carriage is to drive out to the end of one of the docks. No one else is to go out on the docks. The master relayed the order in his mild voice, but as the coachman obeyed him, he clucked his tongue commiseratingly. Signor Bell, you do not expect to escape. Not after killing me. Well, that's absurd. Bell said nothing. He alighted from the carriage, his face set grimly, and stared ashore at the long, long row of terrified faces staring out at him. The whole waterfront seemed to be lined with these staring faces. Wails came from the amassed... Where was I? I was on a roll, too. Wails came from that mass of enslaved human beings. Hold him here, Jameson. I'm going out to look at that big plane. There's a rowboat tied to the dock here. He swung down the side into the dock and rode off into the harbor, while the horses attached to the master's carriage pawed impatiently at the wooden flooring of the dock. Bell reached the 2 small planes anchored on the still harbor water. The smaller one that had brought them here from Buenos Aires, the larger one that had gone after the larger one had gone after the beached amphibian and brought it and Paula onto the city. Bell, from the shore, was seen to be investigating the larger one before he came back. His head appeared above the dock edge. All right, the master has a rule requiring all his ships ready for instant flight. Very useful. The big plane is fueled and full of oil. We'll go out to it and take off. Jameson lifted the master to his feet, and with a surge of muscles swept him down to the flooring of the dock. Paula first, then the master, then you, Jameson. One moment. It'd be cruel not to let me reassure my subjects. I'll give an order. Bell and Jameson listened suspiciously, but he spoke gently to the coachman. You will tell the deputies, said the master in Spanish, that a month's supply of medicine for all my subjects will be found in my laboratory. You may tell them that I shall return before the end of that time. The coachman's eyes filled with a passionate relief. Now I'm ready for our little jaunt. Paula descended the ladder and seated herself in the bow of the boat. Bell covered the master grimly with his automatic as he descended, with surprising agility. Jameson came down last, and resumed his former grip on the master's collar. Bell rode out to the big plane. Jameson kept close watch, while Bell started the 4 huge motors and throttled them down to warming up speed, while he hauled up the anchor with the huge seaplane that it was anchored. That was very strangely worded. Anyway, the dock was covered with a swarm of panic-stricken folk. Everywhere, all the inhabitants of the city who were slaves to the master had come in terrible horror to watch. And all the inhabitants of the city were slaves to the master. Some of them fell to their knees and held out imploring arms to Bell, begging him for mercy and the return of the master. Some cursed wildly, but with his jaws set grimly, Bell gave the motors the gun. The big plane moved heavily, then more swiftly through the water. It lifted slowly and then rose and rose and dwindled to a speck high in the air. And all through the streets and ways of Punta Arenas, fear stalked almost as a tangible thing. Panic hovered over the housetops, always ready to descend. Terror was in the air that every man breathed, and every human being looked at every other human being with staring, haunted eyes. Punta Arenas was waiting for its murder madness to begin. All right, before we dive into the last remaining chapter, I believe it's time for the intermission. So we'll be back in at most 15 minutes. Now is a fantastic time to get up and stretch if you've been sitting with me. Get hydrated if you've been forgetting to drink your water like I have. Take any necessary medications if you've forgotten them. Pet your animals for me. Most especially pet your animals for me. And just generally take care of things. We'll be back, like I said, in about 15 minutes. No, we're not experiencing technical difficulties. We'll be right back. Yeah, we'll be right back. We'll see. Attend, O reader, our tale of wonder. Welcome back to Paper Cuts. Last week we got most of the way through the last chunk of Murder Madness, and now we finally arrive at the final chapter of this much belated serialization of this tale. And I don't want to spend too much more time on ado, so let's just dive right into chapter 18. There were 4 motors to pull the big plane through the air, and their roaring was a vast thundering noise which the earth re-echoed. But inside that cabin, that tumult was reduced to a not intolerable humming sound. I gotta admit, for a second there, I was like, oh, I gotta drink, but this isn't an H.G. Wells book. So, no drink. Although it does seem like this author has a few favorite words. They are not Wells's particular favorite words. So, for context, H.G. Wells tends to have a couple words that he really, really likes. And whenever we're reading an H.G. Wells story, we have ourselves a little bit of a drinking game where you have to drink some water every time a certain set of words come up. And I've been digging to see if other authors have that tendency. Anyway. What'll I do with this devil, Belle? Now that we're aloft, I confess this grenade's making me nervous. I'm holding it tight, so tight my fingers are getting cramped. Tie him up. He'll talk presently. Movements. The plane flew on, swaying slightly in the way of big seaplanes everywhere. A willow wall began in the hills ahead, and swept out and set the ship to reeling crazily in its erratic currents. The strait vanished, and there were tumbled hills below them. Minutes passed. Got him fixed up, I guarantee he's not gonna break loose anytime soon. You got any plans, Belle? No time. Haven't had time to make any. First thing we'll do is to get where his folk will never find us. Then we'll see what we can do with him. Paula looked at the now bound figure of the master, and the little old man beamed at her. He's smiling, said Paula, in a voice that was full of a peculiar, horrified shock. Belle shrugged at this. Punta Arenas was all of 25 miles behind, and the earth over which they flew began to take on the shape of an island. Water appeared beyond it, and innumerable small islands. Belle began to rack his brain for the infinitesimal scraps of knowledge he had about this section of the world. It was pitifully scanty. Punta Arenas was the southernmost point on the continental mass. All about it was an archipelago and a maze of waterways, thinly inhabited everywhere, and largely without any inhabitants at all. The only solid ground between Cape Horn and the Antarctic ice pack was Diego Ramirez and the South Shetlands. That was nothing to go on, but any sufficiently isolated and desolate spot would do. Almost anywhere along the southern edge of the continental islands should serve, really. The plane roared on monotonously, while Belle began to wrestle with another and more serious problem. In 3 days, 2 now, an American naval vessel would turn up with scientists and chemists on board. It would it was to be doubted whether anything like an overt act would be risked by that vessel. If all the governments of South America were under the master's thumb, then cabled orders from his deputies would race 3 navies to the spot, and the government of the United States does not like to start war anywhere. I'll press X to doubt on that one. Certainly it would not willingly enter into a conflict with the whole southern continent for the solution of a problem that so far affected that continent alone. The master's kidnapping had solved nothing so far. Jameson tapped his shoulder. No pursuit so far. I've looked. Bell nodded at this. They don't dare. Not yet, anyhow. They're depending on the master. How is he, by the way? Smiling peacefully to himself, damn him. You know what we're up against? Ourselves, but I'm nearly licked. He's got to talk. Jameson moved away again. The earth below looked as if it had been torn to shreds in some titanic convulsion of ages past. The sea was everywhere, and so was the land. There were little threads of silver interlacing and crossing, wavering erratically in every conceivable direction. And there were specks of islands, rocks only yards in extent, and islands of every imaginable size and shape, with their surfaces in every possible state of upheaval and distortion. A broader mass of land appeared ahead and to the left. Tierra del Fuego again. If we cross it... For 15 minutes, the plane thundered across desolate, rocky hills. Then the maze of islets again. Bell scanned them keenly, saw a tiny steamer traveling smokily, for no conceivable reason, among the scattered bits of stone. The sea appeared, stretching out toward infinity. Bell rose to survey a wider space. He swung to the left, so that he was heading nearly southeast, and went on down toward that desolation of desolations, the stormy cape which faces the eternal ice of the Antarctic. He was 5,000 feet up then, and scanning sea and earth and sky, and suddenly he swung sharply to the right and headed out toward the open sea. He felt a small pressure closing against his shoulder. Presently, fingers closed tightly upon his sleeve. He glanced down at Paula and managed to smile. There are some rocks out there. Islands, I think, and Diego Ramirez at a guess. They were specks, no more, but they were vastly more distinct from the plane than from Mount Bufoy. That's on Henderson Island in New York Sound. New Year Sound, and its 1,700-foot peak was almost below Bell when he sighted the island. Oh, excuse me. That's on Henderson Island in New Year Sound, and its 1,700-foot peak was almost below Bell when he sighted the islands. But the islands have been seen fully 50 miles from here. It took the plane nearly 40 minutes to cover the space, but long before that the islands had become distinct. 2 tiny groups of scattered rocks, the whole group hardly 5 miles in length, and by far the greater number no more than boulders surrounded by sheets of foam from the breakers. 2 of them, perhaps, merited the name of islands. The nearer was high and bare and precipitous. No trace of vegetation showed upon it. The farther was smaller, and at its northern corner a little cove showed, nearly landlocked. Bell descended steeply. The big plane plunged widely in the air eddies about the taller island at 500 feet, but steadied and went winging on down lower and lower. The waves between the 2 islands were not high, but the seaplane alighted with a mighty, tremendous splashing, and Bell navigated it grimly, though clumsily, into the mouth of the cove. There a small beach showed. He went very slowly toward it. Presently he swung abruptly about. A wingtip float grounded close to the shore. The motors cut off and left a thunderous silence in their wake. Bell climbed atop the cabin and let go of the anchor. We're here. Bring the master. We're going ashore. The catwalk painted on the lower wing guided them. Bell jumped to the rocks first and stumbled, then rose to lift Paula down and take the master's small, frail body from Jameson's arms. You look for a gun? He's got nothing to fight with, said Jameson heavily. He'd been facing the same problem Bell had worked on desperately, yet he found no answer. But he shuddered a little as he looked about the island. There was nothing in sight but rock. No moss, no lichens, not even a stringy grass or a tufty scrub brush that seemed to grow everywhere. Bell untied the master, carefully, but without solicitude. The little man sat up and brushed himself off carefully, arranging himself in a comfortable position. I am an old man, you know. You might have at least given me a cushion to sit upon. Bell sat down and lighted a cigarette with fingers that did not tremble in the least. Suppose you talk. First, of what your poison's made out of, what the antidote's made out of. Second, thirdly, how we might be sure you're telling the truth to us. The master looked at him with bright, shrewd, and apparently kindly old eyes. Hijo mio, I am just an old man, but I'm obstinate. I'll tell you nothing. Bell's eyes glowed coldly. Does it occur to you that it's too important a matter for us to have any scruples about, that we can and will make you talk? You may kill me, but that's all. And we only have to get back in your plane yonder and go away. The master beamed at him, and presently began to laugh softly. Hijo mio, let us stop this little byplay. You'll take me back in my airplane, you'll land me at Punta Arenas, and then you will fly away. I concede you freedom, but that's all. You cannot leave me here. Paula, get in the plane again. Jameson. Paula rose doubtfully. Jameson stood up. The master continued to chuckle amiably. You see, he said cherubically, you happen to be a gentleman, Signor Bell. Every man has some weakness, and that's yours. You will not leave me here to die, because you've killed my nephew, who was the only other man who knew how to prepare my little medicine. And you know, Signor, that all my subjects will wish to die. Those who do, in fact, will be fortunate. The effect of my little medicine does not make for happiness without its antidote. Bell clenched his hands at this. You know that there are many thousands of people whose hands will writhe very soon. The city of Punta Arenas will be turned into a snarling place of maniacs within a very little while, if I do not return. Would you like, Signor, to think in days of that pleasant city, filled with men and women tearing each other like beasts, little children even, crouching and crushing and rending the tender flesh of other little children, of lisping little ones gone? Stop! Damn your soul, you're always right. Can't win so far. Always. I win always. And you forget, Signor, you've seen the worst side of my rule, the revolutions, the rebellions that have made men free. Were they pretty things to watch? Always, amigo, the first thing comes. But when my rule is secure, well, then you'll see. He waved a soft, beautifully formed hand. From every possible aspect, the situation was a contradiction of all reason. The bare, black, salt-encrusted rocks with no trace of vegetation showing. The grey water rumbling and surging among the uneven rocks at the base of the shore, gulls screaming hoarsely overhead. The white-haired little man with his benevolent face smiling confidently at the two grim men. That time will come, said the master gently, and in the tone of an utter confidence with one states an unshakable fact. The time will come when all the earth will know my rule. The taking of my little medicine will be as commonplace a thing as the smoking of tobacco, which I abhor, by the way, signores. You are mistaken about there being an antidote and a poison. It's one medicine only, one little compound, a vegetable substance, Signor Bell, combined with a product of modern chemistry. It's a synthetic drug, you see. Modern chemistry is a magnificent science. My little medicine is its triumph. Even my deputies have not heard me speak so, signores. So, is this a reefer madness? Gang, is this a reefer madness? Is that what's happening right now? Get closer, come here. Is this a reefer madness? Is that what's happening? I really hope this isn't a reefer madness. Because if that's what's happening, I'm going to be real mad. If that's the twist here. Anyway. Back to the book. Bell snarled wordlessly, but if one had noticed his eyes, they would have been seen to be curiously cool and alert, and waiting. The master leaned forward, and for once spoke seriously, almost reverently.
There shall be a forward step, Signores, in the race of men. Do you know the difference between the brain of a man and the brain of an anthropoid ape? It consists only of a filmy layer of cortex, a film of grey nerve cells which the ape has not. And that little layer creates the difference between ape and man. I've discovered more. My little medicine, it acts upon that film. Administered in the tiny quantities I've given to my slaves, it has no perceptible effect, merely a compound of a vegetable substance and a synthetic organic base. It is not excreted from the body. Like lead, it remains always in solution in the blood, but in or out of the blood it changes always to the substance which causes murder madness. Fresh or changed, my little medicine acts upon the brain. He smiled brightly upon them. But though in tiny quantities it has but little effect, in larger quantities, well, when fresh, it makes the functioning grey cells of the human brain far superior as the unmedicated grey cells, as those human grey cells out of the white cells of the ape. This is what I have to offer the human race: intelligence for every man, which shall be as the genius of the past. Think, senores. Compare the estate of men with the estate of apes. Compare the civilization which will arise upon the earth when men's brains are as far above their present level as the present level is above the anthropoid. The upward steps of the human race under my rule will surpass the advance from the brutish caveman to intellectual genius. But I've seen, senores, the one danger in my offering. There was silence at this. Jameson shook his head despairingly. The master couldn't see him, and he formed the word with his lips. Crazy. But Bell said coldly, Go on. I must rule. It's essential. If my little secret were known, intelligences would be magnified, but under many flags and with many aims. Scientists with genius beside which Newton's pales would seek out deadly weapons for war. The world would destroy itself of its own genius, but under my rule, men go mad. The master smiled reproachfully. Ah, you're trying to make me angry so that I'll betray something? You're clever, Signor Bell. With my little medicine in such quantities as I'd administer it to you. You describe it as a brain stimulant, but it drives men mad. To be sure, it does. It is not excreted from the body, save very, very slowly, but it changes in the bloodstream, as, let us say, sugar changes into alcohol in digestion. The end product of my little medicine is a poison which attacks the brain, but the slightest bit of unchanged medicine is an antidote. It is a sugar in the body changed to alcohol, and alcohol was a poison, but sugar unchanged was an antidote. That is it exactly. You see that I've taken my little medicine for years. It's not harmed me. Which, said Bell, and somehow his manner made utter silence fall so that each word fell separately into a vast stillness, which, thank God, is the one thing that wins finally for me. He stood up and laughed, quite a genuine laugh. Paolo, get on the plane, in the cabin. James and I are going to strip the master. Paula stared, and the master looked at him blankly. Jameson frowned bewilderedly, but he stood up grimly to obey. But, Signor, merely to humiliate me. Not for that. Bell laughed again. All the time I've been hearing about the stuff, I've noticed nobody thought it as a drug. It was a poison. People were poisoned. They didn't become addicts. But you are the only addict to your drug. He turned to Jameson, his eyes gleaming. Jameson, did you ever know of a drug addict who could bear to think of ever being without a supply of his drug right on his person? By God, no! The master was quick. He was swarming up the plane wingtip before Jameson reached him, and he kicked frenziedly when Jameson plucked him off. But it was wholly, entirely, utterly horrible that the little white-haired man whose face and manner seemed so cherubic and so bland could shriek in so complete a blind panic as they forced his fingers open and took a fountain pen away from him. This is it. This is his point of weakness. I mean, ostensibly, alcohol in a large enough dose can be a poison. If you think about it, when college students, for example, are admitted to the hospital with alcohol poisoning, it's because they've taken too much. Your body cannot outpace the alcohol. I think what he's trying to describe is as though the concept he's describing is a drug that interacts with your brain in one way, but then when it begins to interact with your blood later, as it is further metabolized, it becomes properly poisonous. Although, honestly, what he's really describing here sounds more like just withdrawal symptoms. Like it's a stimulant that activates your brain to work harder and better. And you just get withdrawals so bad you go crazy. That's how I read it anyway, with a modern eye. And I could name a particular plant that has been altered with the use of modern chemistry that may fit here, but I will leave that as an exercise to the reader, lest I am incorrect. The master was ghastly to look at it now. The master was ghastly to look at now. Jameson held him gently enough, considering everything, but the master looked at that fountain pen as one might look at paradise. I swear I'll give you the formula. You might lie. I swear it. If the formula is known, it can be duplicated. The excretion will be hastened. It can all be forced from the body. Simply, so simply. If only you know, I will tell you how it's done. The medicine is the cacodilator. Bell was leaning forward now like a runner, resting the tape at the end of a long and exhausting race. I'll trade half the contents of the pen for the formula. The other half we need for analysis. Half the stuff in the pen for the formula for freeing your slaves. The master sobbed at this. A pencil, I swear. Jameson gave him a pencil and a notebook. He wrote, his hands shaking, and Jameson read it inscrutably. Doesn't mean anything to me, but you read it. It's legible, isn't it? Bell smiled faintly. With a steady finger, he took his own fountain pen from his pocket. He emptied it of ink and put a scrupulous half of a milky liquid from the master's pen into it. And he passed it over. Your medicine may taste somewhat of ink, but it won't be poisonous. Now what do we do with you? I give you your choice. If we take you with us, you'll be held very secretly as a prisoner until the truth of the information you've given us can be proven. And if your slaves have all been freed, then I suppose you'll be tried. Well, one expects, anyway. The master was drawn and haggard. He looked very, very old and beaten. I would prefer that you did not tell them where I am. You go away and leave me here. I may have some subjects who'll search for me. They may discover me here. But I'm beaten, Signor. You know that you've won. Bell swung up on the wing of the plane. He explored about in the cabin and came back. These are emergency supplies. We'll leave them with you, with such things as may be useful to allow you to hope as long as possible. I don't think you'll ever be found here. I prefer it, Signor. I will catch fish. Jameson helped put the packages ashore. The master shivered. Bell stripped off his coat and put it on top of the heap of packages. The master didn't stir. Bell laid a revolver on top of his coat. He went out to the plane and started the motors. The master watched apathetically as the big seaplane pulled clumsily out of the little cove. The rumble of the engines became a mighty roar. It started forward with a rush, skimming the water for 200 yards or so, and suddenly lifted clear to go floating away through the air toward the north. Paolo was the only one who looked back. He's crying. Isn't fear. It's grief at the loss of his ambition. May not seem so to you two, but I believe he really meant all that stuff he told me. He was probably really aiming in his own way for an improved world of men to live in. The plane roared on. Presently Bell said shortly, Stuff he has won't last indefinitely. Glad I left him that revolver. Jameson stirred suddenly. He dug down in his pocket and fished out a cigar. Since I feel I might live long enough to finish smoking this, I think I'll light it. Haven't felt that I had 20 minutes of my life ahead of me for a long time now. Sense of economy made me smoke cigarettes. Wouldn't be so much waste if you left half a cigarette behind you when you died. The tight little cabin began to reek of the tobacco. Paula pressed close to Bell. But, Charles, is it really over all now? I think so. Our job's over anyhow. Go up the Chilean coast, find that Navy boat.
turn our stuff over to them. They'll take over the task, seeing that every doctor everywhere in South America knows how to get the Master's poison out of the system of anybody who's affected. Some of them won't be reached, but most of them will. Look at his formula, standard drugs, all of them. There won't be any trouble getting the news spread. Master's slaves will nearly go crazy with joy, and I'm gonna go see to it that the Rio police take back what they said about us. Think we'll have enough pull to demand that much. He was silent for a moment or so, thinking. I do think, Jameson, that we did a pretty good job. Jameson grunted. If it's really over, Charles. What? You will be able to think about me sometimes instead of about the Master anyways? Belle stared down at her. Good Lord, I've been a brute, Paula. I've been loving you the... He stopped and then said, with the elaborate politeness and something of the customary idiotic air of a man making such an announcement. I say, Jameson, did you not know that Paula and I were to be married? Jameson snorted and then replied placidly, No, of course not. I never dreamed of such a thing. Where did this remarkably original idea occur to you? He puffed a huge cloud of smoke from his cigar. It was an unusually vile one. Belle scowled at him helplessly for a moment, then said wrathfully, go to hell. Then he bent over and kissed Paula. And that's the end. Ooh, interesting here. In the next issue, if we ever get around to the September issue, we'd be reading Jeddah of the Lowlands, another 3-part novel. Nares Deep by Ray Cummings. Ray Cummings is, that's a name I recognize. An Attack from Space. Ooh, An Attack from Space. It's a sequel to Beyond the Heaviside Layer by Captain S.P. Meek. We've definitely read Beyond the Heaviside Layer on the show before, I think. Marooned Under the Sea by Paul Ernst. And, ideally, the conclusion of that tremendous novel by Arthur J. Burks. The one that has Earth poised to maraud upon Mars. We'll see if we ever get to the September issue. I have some plans. Well, planned. And potentially the September issue is on our docket. We'll see. That said, no shade to Arthur J. Burks and, his descendants, but I'm not particularly pressed to see how Earth the Marauder concludes things. I have some other things on the docket that would potentially work a little better. Anyway, the last remaining story of our issue this fine evening is The Flying City by H. Thompson Rich. Enjoy your sleep, RNL. I'm very glad that you stuck around. You didn't have to. It's very easy to just drop by for a raid and be like, I have to sleep. That's usually what I wind up doing, is I want to be in chat and be there, but, completely understand if you need to raid and fade, as it were. Yeah, I definitely stole that from I stole that from Hesper. I almost said Lumi, but she's rebranded. But I stole that from a VTuber streamer known as Hesper's Quest. It's a very fun little rhyming phrase, isn't it? Anyway, that short story we're gonna read, The Flying City by H. Thompson Rich. In the burning solitude of the great Arizona desert, some 2 miles south of Vallejo, a young scientist was about to perform an experiment that might have far-reaching results for humanity. The scientist was Gordon Kendrick, a tall, tanned, robust chap who looked more like a prospector in search of gold than a professor of physics from the State University of Tucson. Indeed, he was, in a way, a prospector, since it was gold he sought.
some practical method of tapping the vast radio-energetic treasure of the sun, and it was an apparatus designed to accomplish just this that he was about to test. The primary unit of the mechanism comprised a spheroidal vacuum tube measuring a little over a foot across its long axis, mounted in a steel bracket that held it horizontal with the ground. Down through its short axis ran a shaft on which was centered a light cross of aluminum wire carrying 4 veins of mica, one face of each coated with lampblack. A flexible cable led from the bottom of this shaft to the base of the bracket, where it was geared to a small electric motor driven by 2 dry cells. A rheostat switch was for delivering and controlling the current was mounted nearby. At the wide arc of the egg-shaped tube was a concave platinum cathode. At the narrow arc, a nib of some sort ending in a socket. From this socket, 2 heavy insulated wires extended 60 feet or so across the sand to the secondary unit of the mechanism, which was roughly a series of resistance coils, resembling those in an ordinary electric heater. So is this man, like... Hang on. So is this like a solar, like, propeller that's driving this electric motor to produce electricity, or is this some kind of like I have no idea if this would actually work or not, or is this like some kind of large vacuum tube based solar panel? When were solar panels invented? That is a good question. When were solar panels invented? Because, like, if you think about it, doping of silicon crystals is very, like, difficult mechanically. Oh, so there are avenues to solar power outside of doped silicon. Really? Yeah, Edmund Becquerel discovers the photovoltaic effect in 1839. A few decades later, Augustin Mochot registered some solar engines in the 1860s, solar-powered devices as early as 1888. New York inventor Charles Fritz created the first solar cell by coating selenium with a thin layer of gold. Fritz reported the selenium module produced a current that is continuous, constant, and of considerable force. This cell achieved an energy conversion rate of 1 to 2% in 1883. So, apparently non-silicon, non-doped silicon solar cells have existed much farther. Solar cells generally have existed since 1883. So this, yeah, for context, most modern solar cells work at an efficiency of 15 to 20%, but this 1883 example achieved an energy conversion rate of 1 to 2%, purportedly. Huh. Interesting. That's fascinating. So I assume... See, like, if you think about it, the, like, hot salt method of solar power, where it's like it's a bunch of concentrating arrays that beam a, like, you know, fist-sized beam of sunlight at something and heat it way up to make steam, that's pretty simple. You could do that with a lot of, like, a lot less technology than we have actively now, but it's kind of wild to think about that, like, a literal photovoltaic solar panel existed in 1883. Kind of crazy. Anyway, this guy made a vacuum tube that has a set of fan vanes that are driven by a small electric motor attached to a battery, and that's all in a vacuum tube. And then outside the vacuum tube, there's a cathode, and then from the socket, there are wires to a set of resistance coils that kind of look like an electric heater. Interesting. Well, let's find out what it does. As Kendrick prepared to test this delicate apparatus that represented so much of his time and thought, held so much of his hope locked up in it, a turmoil was in his heart, though his browned face was calm.
If his theories were right, that revolving cross would tap and draw into its vein radioenergetic waves of force, much as the whirling armature of a dynamo draws into its coils electromagnetic waves of force. For the blackened sides of the veins, absorbing more radiation than the bright sides, would cause the molecules to rebound from the warmer surfaces with greater velocity, setting up an alternate pressure and bringing the rays to focus on a cathode, where they would be reflected to the nib as waves of heatricity, to use the word that he coined. You know that little thing they sell in science kits sometimes? It's like a little light bulb and you set it in the sun and like the difference in temperature causes air currents and the thing goes and spins. That's what I'm thinking of here. Anyway, those were Kendrick's theories, and now he moved to put them to the supreme test. Switching on the current, he set the motor going. In response, the cross began to revolve, slowly at first, then faster and faster as he opened the rheostat wider. Eyes fixed on his resistance coils, he gave a sudden cry of triumph. Yes, there was no doubt about it. They were growing red, glowing brightly, whitely above the intense desert sunlight. Here was a means of convening solar radiation into heat, then, that offered tremendous commercial possibilities. But even as he exulted, there came a blinding flash, and the overtaxed coils burst into flame. Shielding his eyes from the glare, he reached for the rheostat, shut off the current, and rushed to his secondary unit, where he beheld an amazing sight. Not only had this part of the apparatus completely disintegrated, but the sand of the desert floor under it as well. On the spot quivered a miniature lake of molten glass. As Kendrick stood ruefully beside that fiery pool, meditating on the spectacular but not altogether gratifying results of his experiment, a peculiar low humming sound reached his ears. Rushing back to his primary unit, with the thought that perhaps by some chance he had not fully closed the rheostat, he looked at the cross. But no, the veins were still. The humming, however, increased. It grew into a vibration that made his eardrums ache. Puzzled, he looked around. What on earth could it be? Had his unruly experiment called into play some tremendous, unsuspected force of the universe? Was he to bring the world to ruin as a result of his blind groping after this new giant of power? Such predictions had often been made by the ignorant, to be dismissed by scientists as the veriest nonsense. But was there some truth in the universal fear after all? Was he to be the Prometheus that stole fire from Olympus, the Samson who toppled down the temple? Chilled, dizzied with the pain of ever-increasing vibration, he gritted his teeth, awaiting he knew what not. Then it came, a spectacle so staggering that he went rigid with awe as he regarded it, all power of motion utterly numbed for just the moment. The vibration ceased. The thing appeared. It was a city. A city in the air? A flying city. As Kendrick stood staring at this phenomenon, he could scarcely credit his senses. Had the magic carpet of Baghdad suddenly materialized before him, he would not have been more astounded. And indeed, it was, in a way, a magic carpet, a great disc-like affair several miles in diameter, its myriad towers and spires glinting like gold under the noonday sun, while its vast shadow fell athwart the desert like the pall of an eclipse. I see even writers of the 1930s are not immune to Flying City. Not immune to the allure of Flying City. I'm a huge sucker for any fantasy, especially any fantasy setting, but it's still fun in like science fiction settings where it's like, yeah, the city just flies. It's just cool like that. It just flies around and lives its little city-based life wherever the heck it wants. I just think that's so cool. Like I structured my D&D setting around the idea of and this is a bit of a spoiler, I guess, for the campaign kind of, but I structured my homebrew D&D setting around the idea of what if there was a flying city and it crashed? What would it have an effect on like a continent about the size of England? And how would the rest of the world respond as well? It's just really fun. It's really fun to speculate in that manner, and like it's especially fun. That was a firework. It echoed very thoroughly. Anyway, Flying City go burr. Ugh. I agree, Magnus. That's a very loud sound. I hope y'all can't hear that. The lower portion, he noted, was in the main flat, though a number of wartish protuberances jutted down from it, ejecting a pale violet emanation. Whatever this was, it seemed to have the effect of holding the thing motionless in the air, for it hovered there quite easily, 100 yards or so above the ground. But what was it? Where was it from? What had brought it? These were the questions he wanted answered, and there were to be, sooner than he knew. As he stood there, speculating, a device like a trapdoor opened in the base of the disk, and creatures resembling human beings began floating down, however. Whereupon Kendrick did what any sensible man would have done in similar circumstances. He reacted in motion. In short, he ran. Glancing back over his shoulder after a minute or two, however, he drew up sheepishly. Of that strange apparition and those who had descended from it, there was not a trace, not even a shadow. But the peculiar humming had recommenced, he realized, in the next breath, and at the same instant he felt himself seized by invisible hands. There was a struggle, but it was brief and futile. When it was over, his captors became visible once more. They were singular little beings, about 4 feet tall, with strange, wise, leathery faces, their heads grotesquely bald. The humming had ceased again. The disk, too, was once more visible. What happened next was something even more astounding, if there could be any further degrees of wonder possible for the utterly baffled young scientist. He felt himself lifted up, leaving the desert floor, whirling away toward that incredible phenomenon hovering there. Another moment or two, and he had been borne up through its trapdoor opening, was standing in a dark space bounded by solid metal walls. Then he was thrust into a cylinder with several of his tiny guards shot swiftly upward. A door opened as they came to rest, and he was led out into a vast court of gleaming amber crystal. Something like a taxi slid up with iridescent planes, and he was bundled into it, whirled away again. Down broad, gleaming avenues they passed, where similar traffic flowed densely, but under marvelous control. Towering skyscrapers loomed to the right and to the left. Tier on tier of upper and lower boulevards revealed themselves, all crowded with automotive and pedestrian activity. At length a stupendous concourse was reached. Thousands of these taxis and similar vehicles were parked along its broad flanks, while literal swarms of diminutive individuals circulated to and fro. Assisted from the vehicle that had brought him to this obvious center of the disk's activities, Kendrick was led into a monumental structure of jade-green stone that towered a full 100 stories above the street level. There he was escorted into another of those projectile-like elevators, shot up and up and up until at length it came to rest. The door opened and he was led out into a small lobby of the same amber crystal that he had observed before. By now his guards had diminished too, but he no longer made any effort to escape. Wherever this amazing adventure might lead, he was resolved to follow it through. One of the guards had advanced to a jeweled door and was pressing a button. In response, the door opened. A golden-robed, regal creature stood there. Though dwarfed to 4 feet like his fellows, he was obviously their mental superior to a prodigious degree. Not only was his symmetrical bald head of large brain content, but the finely cut features of his parchment face bore the unmistakable stamp of a powerful intellect. "All chaw!" commanded this evident monarch of the disk, addressing the guards. They bowed deeply and departed abruptly. "My dear Kendrick," the royal personage now said in thin, precise... it's thin English, okay. "My dear Kendrick," the royal personage now said in thin, precise English, "it is indeed a pleasure to welcome you to my humble quarters. Pray enter and make yourself comfortable." Whereupon he ushered him into a dazzling apartment that was one vast mosaic of precious gems, indicated a richly carved chair, into which the young scientist dropped, wonderingly. "Now then, Professor," continued the mighty little dwarf, when he was seated in a chair even more sumptuous, Suppose we have a friendly little discussion. I've been much interested in your experiments on heat radiation. What you demonstrated this morning in particular was most absorbing. You've hit upon a rather profound scientific principle, yes? Possibly, Kendrick admitted, quite conscious he was being patronized. Oh, don't be modest, my dear fellow. I'm the last one to belittle your achievement. Indeed, it is because of it that I've invited you here today. Permit me to introduce myself and to make clear one or two possibly perplexing matters that I'm sure we'll have a most agreeing chat. His name was Kor, he said, and he was in search of the monarch of this strange realm. His people had come from the one-time planet of Vada, far distant in the universe. 1,000 years ago, this planet had been doomed by the approach of an alien star. Their great scientist, Rav, who had met the emergency by inventing the disk into whose construction they poured all their resources, I misread that. Their great scientist, Rav, had met the emergency by inventing the disk into whose construction they had poured all their resources. The pick of the populace had been salvaged on this grand life raft. The rest had perished when that destroying star had crashed down on the doomed Vada. Since then, these survivors and their descendants had been voyaging through space on their marvelous disk. For hundreds of years they'd given no thought to the future, content to drift on and on in the interstellar void, breathing an atmosphere produced artificially. But at length the inevitable had happened. This superb piece of mechanism devised by their super genius Rav was beginning to show signs of wear. Some of its mighty engines were nearing the exhaustion point. Either they must soon find a planet comparable with the one they'd known, where they could pause and rehabilitate their machinery, or they must disintegrate and pass into oblivion. Faced with that crisis, Kor had long been seeking such a planet. He found it, at last, in the earth, and had resolved that this was where they were going to alight and transplant the civilization of ancient Vada, pending such time as they could take to space again. For some months now they'd been hovering over various portions of the earth, studying its geography and its peoples, with the result that they had concluded the United States offered the most logical point for launching the attack. Once this country was subdued, they were in possession of the richest and most advanced section of the planet. The conquest of the rest of it, it could await their leisure. With such an invasion in view, their scientists had mastered the language of the country. This had been accomplished very easily, since in addition to the power of mingling with the populace in invisible form, they had the principles of radio developed to such a high degree they were able to tune in on any station they wanted. Kendrick sat there, stunned, as Kor followed his astounding revelation of their origin, with his calm plan for the conquest of America, and then of the world. Why, of all the people on Earth, had he alone been singled out for the disclosure? A question he asked of Kor immediately. "My dear Professor, can't you really guess?" replied Kor with that leathery smile. "Hasn't it dawned on you that you are a little too near our own field with that machine of yours? A trifle more research, a slightly different application, you would have become a dangerous enemy." You mean? "I mean there isn't a great deal of difference between the experiments you've been making and those our great Rav once made. For instance, had you broadcast your heatricity, as you call it, instead of trying to transmit it on wires, picture a receiving apparatus in each home of the land like commercial radio sets. You'd become a billionaire, don't you see?" Kendrick saw this indeed. It was simple, so simple. Why hadn't he thought of it? "But your invention will never make you wealthy now, my dear fellow. You'll be our guest here until we've taken over your interesting country. After that, if there's any need for the broadcasting of heat, we'll furnish it ourselves. We have those facilities, among others, fully developed. Would you care to see our plan?" Kendrick naturally admitted that he would, so the dwarf led him through a rear door and up a winding flight of stairs. They emerged presently into a great laboratory housed in the glass-roofed pinnacle of the tower. There he beheld a sight that left him breathless. Never before had he seen such an assemblage of scientific apparatus. Its vastness and strangeness were fairly overpowering, even to a man as well versed in physiochemical paraphernalia as he was. Before his eyes could take in a tenth part of the spectacle, Cord led him to the left wall. There you will observe a development of your heat generator. Kendrick looked to see a long bank of large vacuum tubes, each about 3.5 feet high and a foot wide, connected by a central shaft that caused a series of little vanes in each of them to revolve at lightning speed. Around the apparatus moved numerous small attendants, oiling, wiping, adjusting its many delicate parts. Well, what do you think now? Kendrick made no reply, though he was thinking plenty. You see, it is your invention, my dear Professor, the dwarf went on in his taunting voice. Only anteceded by 1,000 years. Rather more perfected, you must admit. He walked now to the center of the laboratory, where stood a huge dial of white crystal, ranked with many levers and switches, all capped with that same material. Behold, he said, throwing over one. Instantly there came again that peculiar low humming that had so puzzled him a few minutes before, and the entire room, its engines, its attendants, Core himself, leapt into invisibility. Only Kendrick remained, facing the faintly visible crystal dial. Then he saw a switch move as though automatically, but no, for the dwarf's hand was on it now. Visibility had returned, the vibration ceasing. That is central control. Our city and all its inhabitants become invisible when that switch is thrown. Only the dial remains for the guidance of the operator, and even that cannot be seen at a distance of more than 50 feet. Now behold! He raised his hand, touched a watch-like device strapped to his wrist, and was instantly invisible. But the laboratory and every machine and person in it, those remained in plain view. Nor was there any vibration now. The next moment, having touched the curious little device again, Cora reappeared. That is the local control. Every one of our inhabitants, except those under discipline, has one of these little mechanisms. It enables us to make ourselves invisible at will. A convenience at times, you must admit. Decidedly. And the principle? Quite simple. One of those, in fact, that lies behind your researches. Doubtless you would have hit upon it yourself in time. Your own scientist Faraday, you may recall, held the opinion that various forms under which the forces of matter manifest themselves have a common origin. We of the disk, thanks to our great row, have found the common origin. It was the origin of matter itself, Core said, which lay in the ether of interstellar space. Energy, raw, cosmic, vibrations, rays. By harnessing and controlling these various rays, his people had been able to accomplish all their seeming miracles. Miracles that the people of Earth, too, were beginning to achieve, as in electricity, for instance, and its further application as in radio. But the people of Virida... Oh, no, Vada. I don't know how I read Virida. But the people of Vada had long since mastered such powerful rays, rather, had mastered such simple rays, and now, in possession of vastly more powerful ones, had the elemental forces of the universe at their disposal. The disk was propelled through space by short rays of tremendously high frequency up above the ultraviolet. The same rays, directed downward instead of outward, enabled them to overcome the pull of gravity when in a planet's influence, as at present. And the escalator rays, by which they could proceed to and from the disk, were also of high frequency, as were their invisibility rays. But you, Professor, are more interested in low-frequency rays, the long ones down below infrared. You've seen our development of the heat dynamo principle. It utilizes, I might add, not only solar radiation, but the stars themselves as well. There being 1.5 billion of these in the universe, many of them 1,000 times or more large as your sun, we naturally have a quite efficient little heating plant here. Provides us with our weapon of warfare, as well as keeping us warm. Permit me to demonstrate.
He led the way to a gleaming circle of glass, like an inverted telescope, about a yard in diameter, mounted in the floor. Look! Kendrick did so, and there, spread below him, lay the floor of the desert. His camp, his apparatus, were just as he left them. Cor now moved toward the dial. Behold! He said, pulling a lever. Instantly, the scene below was an inferno. Stricken by a blast of stupendous heat, the whole area went molten, lay quivering like a lake of lava in the crater of an active volcano. Suppose, my dear professor, smiled the dwarf, strolling back from the dial. Just suppose, for an instance, that instead of the lonely camp of an obscure scientist, your proud city of New York had been below there. Kendrick shuddered at this. Well, now he knew the terrible power, the appalling menace of this strange invader. I'd prefer not to make such a supposition, he said quietly, with a last thoughtful glance at that witch's cauldron below. Then let us think of pleasanter things. You are my guest of honor, sir. America's foremost scientist, though she may never realize it. Tonight there will be a great banquet in your honor. Meanwhile, I suppose I'll show you to your quarters. Nettled, fuming though outwardly calm, Kendrick permitted himself to be escorted from the laboratory to an ornate apartment on one of the lower floors. There Cor left him with a polite hint that he would find plenty of attendants handy should he require anything. Alone now in the midst of this vast nightmarish metropolis, he paced back and forth, knowing the hideous fate that threatened the world, but ever more powerless to issue one word of warning, much less avert it. Kendrick was still thinking and brooding along these lines when he saw the door of his apartment swiftly open and close again. Someone had entered, invisibly. Backing away, he waited, tense. Then, suddenly, his visitor materialized. With a gasp, he saw standing before him a beautiful girl. She was a young woman, rather, in her early 20s. Not one of these pygmies of the disc either, but a tall, slender creature of his own world. Her hair was dark, modishly bobbed. Her eyes were a deep, clear brown, her skin a warm olive, and she was dressed as though she'd just stepped off Fifth Avenue, which indeed she had not so long ago, as he was soon to learn. I hope I haven't startled you too much, Mr. Kendrick, but there wasn't any other way. Oh, I suppose I'll get over it, but you have the advantage of me, since you know my name. Her name was Marjorie Blake, she told him then. Not the daughter of Henderson Blake. Yes, his only daughter. Whereupon Kendrick knew the solution of a mystery that had baffled the police for weeks. The newspapers had been full of it at the time. This beautiful girl, whose father was one of America's richest men and president of its largest bank, had disappeared as though the earth had swallowed her. She left their summer estate at Great Neck, Long Island, on a bright June morning, bound for New York on a shopping tour, and, well, simply vanished. Suicide had been hinted at by some of the papers, but had not been taken seriously, since she had no apparent motive for such a thing. Abduction seemed to be the more logical explanation, and huge rewards had been offered by her frantic parents, all to no avail. What had happened was, she now explained, that after visiting several shops and making a number of purchases, she had stepped in a Central Park at the plaza for a breath of fresh air before lunching at the Sherry Netherlands, where she planned to meet some friends. But before advancing 100 yards along the secluded path, she had been seized by invisible hands and felt something strapped to her wrist before anyone came in sight, and then, invisible herself, had been lifted up, whirled away into a vast, humming vibration that sounded through the air. Once on the disk, it had swept off into space at an incredible speed, pausing only when some hundreds of miles above the Earth and invisible from below without mechanical aid. When its vibration finally ceased, that amazing city leapt before her eyes. Then, finding her own visibility restored, she had been led into the presence of that mighty little monarch, Cor, who had explained she had been seized as a hostage and be held as an ace in the hole, pending conquest of her country. Since then, she had been a prisoner aboard the disk. Learning of Kendrick's capture from gossip among the women, she had taken the first opportunity of coming to him, in the hope that they
might be able to devise some means of escape together. Indeed, that was his fondest hope, their imperative need if the people of America and of the earth were to be saved from this appalling menace. But what basis was there for such a fantastic hope? Just one that he could see. That thing on your wrist, I'm surprised they let you wear one of those. They don't. I stole it from one of the maids in my apartment. It was the only way I could get here without being seen. I felt I must see you at once. We've got to do something soon or it'll be too late. I felt that as a scientist, you might have some idea how we could get off of here. How the people themselves get off of here. That escalator ray, do you know how they use it? No, I've never been able to find out. They don't let me go near that part of the city. Kendrick reflected on this in a moment. Let's have a look at that invisibility affair. She removed it from her wrist, handed it to him, and somewhat in awe, he examined it. The mechanism portion, which was linked in a strap of elastic metal, resembled only superficially a watch he now saw, because it had the appearance of some delicate electric switch. Rectangular in shape, it was divided in two halves by a band of white crystal. In each of those halves were two little buttons of the same material, those on one side round and on the other square. Which buttons control the invisibility? The square ones. One's pushed in now, you see. If you should push the other, the first would come out and you'd pass out of the picture, so to speak. Kendrick was half tempted to try the thing then and there, but deferred the impulse. What are the round buttons for? Marjorie didn't know, but thought they were probably an emergency pair in case something went wrong with the square ones. In any event, nothing happened when you pushed them. Kendrick pushed one just to see. It was true. Nothing happened, but he seemed to sense a faint, peculiar vibration, and a wave of giddiness swept over him. On pushing the other, which released the first, it stopped. He handed the device back to Marjorie. There's your bracelet. Now, if I can just get one like it, I think we'll get you down to Earth all right. Oh, Mr. Kendrick, then you thought of a way? Not exactly. I think I've discovered their own way. Can't be certain, but I'm willing to gamble on it if you are. Then you think those round buttons are connected to the escalator rays? Exactly. I think they control individual descent and ascent, just as the square ones control individual visibility and invisibility. At any rate, it's the hunch that I'm going to act on right now, if you're with me. Oh, I'm with you. Anything, well, death almost should be preferable to this. And stand by invisible. Gotta get one of my jailers in here, relieve him of his own wristwatch. Marjorie touched the little square button on her own wrist and became invisible. Kendrick touched a button too, a button he'd noticed beside the door. As he had supposed, it brought one of the Vadens. Shutting the door quietly, he seized the fellow before he could move his hand to his wrist. Thwarted in his attempt to vanish from sight, the diminutive guard attempted an outcry, but Kendrick promptly throttled it. Marjorie had reappeared by now. Together they bound him to a chair, the gilded cord torn from the drapery. Removing the precious mechanism from his wrist, Kendrick slipped it on his own. Now let's go, he said, pressing the protruding square button of the device. We haven't a minute to... My golly, what a peculiar sensation. It is rather odd, isn't it? She laughed, pressing her own and joining him in that invisible realm. Feels like a combination of electric massage and cold shower. Where are you, anyway? Can't see you. Of course you can't. Here. He felt her brush him. Better hold hands, he suggested, then gave an invisible flush he was glad she didn't see. All right, good idea. Her delicate hand came into his, soft and warm, heart vibrating even faster than his body, his whole being a-quiver with a strange exaltation. Kendrick opened the door, and they left the apartment. The next half hour was the tensest either of them had either experienced. Every foot of the way was fraught with peril. Not only did they have to carefully avoid the visible swarms of little people who hurried everywhere, but had to be on their guard as well against any who might be moving about like themselves under cover invisibility. Nor could they use any elevator or public conveyances, but they were obliged to make their way down the concourse to heaven. They were obliged to make their way down to the concourse by heaven knew how many flights of stairs, and cross heaven knew how many teeming streets on foot before they reached the Amber Court,
below which the trapdoor in their hope of freedom. They got there at last, however, descended and peered down from the yawning brink upon the desert floor, to draw back with gasps of dismay, for the area still gleamed semi-molten from the stupendous blast that had wiped out Kendrick's camp. "What is it?" Swiftly he told her. "Isn't there any way around it? Look, over there to the left. One edge of the crater seems to end almost underneath us." It was true that the center of the cauldron was far to the right of where they stood, that its left rim was only a little within their direct line of descent, but to land even 1 foot inside that inferno would be as fatal as to alight in its very midst. Kendrick was thinking fast. "There's just a chance. It depends on how wide the zone of the escalator rays is, and whether we can tune in on them. At least I can probably answer the latter question." Pushing the protrudent round button on his mysterious bracelet as he spoke, he leaned over the edge of the trapdoor and awaited results. They were not long in coming. The vibration he was already under from the invisibility rays seemed to double. Alternate waves of giddiness and depression, of push and pull, swept over him. A minute of it was enough. He pressed the round button that now protruded, ending this influence, and faced Marjorie, stating, "I'm positive now that these things control descent and ascent. As nearly as I can figure, the rays work on the principle of an endless belt. If you're up here, you get carried down, and vice versa. As to how wide the belt is, whether you can move sideways on it, remains to be seen. Anyway, I'm going to take a chance. I'll go first. If my guess is wrong, well, you needn't follow me." "No, I'm coming with you. We've come this far together. I shan't be left alone now. Let's go." And again her soft, warm hand was in his. Good Lord, what a girl! How many would be brave enough to take a gamble like that on a fellow's mere supposition? "All right, go it is. Brush a round button like this." He showed her the way he thought was right, and pushed his own. "Ready?" "Ready." Their voices were grave. It was a grim prospect, stepping off into space like that, with only a guess between them and death. "Then jump." They jumped, gripping each other's hands tightly. Instead of dropping like plummets that they were caught. They jumped, gripping each other's hands tightly, and instead of dropping like plummets, they were caught in a powerful field of force and whirled gently downward. "Oh, you were right. See, we—" Then she paused, horror-stricken, for it was obvious they were to descend within that lake of molten glass, unless they could change their course at once. "Quick, hold fast. Now, run!" Breathless, they raced to the left across that invisible descending belt. Too far, Kendrick knew, and they'd plunge outside its zone, fall crushed and mangled. Not far enough, however, they'd meet cremation. It was a fearful hazard either way, but it had to be taken. They were almost down now, and still not quite far enough to the left. The heat of that yawning crater rose toward them. "Faster! Faster!" he cried, fairly dragging her along with him. A last dash, a breathless instant, and they stood there on the ground not 3 feet from the edge of their doom. Swooning with the heat, Marjorie swayed against him, murmuring an incoherent prayer. "Take heart," he whispered, lifting her bodily and bearing her some yards away. "We're down. We're safe." Their safety was but relative, however, Kendrick well knew. Until they could put miles between them and this monstrous disk, they were not really safe. No telling how soon their escape might be discovered, no telling what terrible means Core might take of curbing their flight. So as soon as Marjorie had recovered sufficiently to proceed, they headed off across the desert, at a fast walk toward Ajo, where he hoped to catch the afternoon train for Gila Bend. From there they could board the limited for Tucson and points east when it came through Yuma that night. They'd tuned out the escalator rays, but continued on still invisible, for the disk hung above them in plain view. Would have been suicide to let them be seen. Even so, Kendrick soon began to have an uneasy feeling of being followed. He looked around from time to time, but could see nothing. Were some of those invisible little creatures on the trail? He said nothing to Marjorie of his anxiety, but presently she too began glancing backward uneasily every few steps. "They're near us. I can sense them." It was more than sense, they soon discovered. Little paddings became quite audible, and once or twice they saw the sand scuffed up not 20 feet away, as though by a foot passing over it.
Meanwhile, they were climbing a rise of ground broken by many small hummocks and dotted with thorny shrubs. On the other side, at the foot of a long downslope, lay Asia. When they reached the stomach, once they reached the summit, Ooh. Once they reached the summit, Kendrick felt sure they could outdistance their pursuers on the descent. Already, if his watch was right, the train was preparing to pull out. It'd be a breathless dash, but he was confident they could make it. So he reassured Marjorie as best he could and helped her up on the slope. They were practically on the summit and already in view of the little railroad station and huddled shacks below when suddenly he felt himself tripped and flung violently to the ground. At the same instant, his companion emitted a scream. She felt herself seized by invisible hands. Leaping to his feet, Kendrick flailed out with solid fists at their attackers. Groans answered the impacts, and he knew that his blows were taking effect. Free for a moment, he dashed to Marjorie, felt for one of the midgets who swarmed around her. Seizing one of the invisible forms, he lifted it and flung it crashing to the ground. Another, and likewise another. Let me just remind you all that this was written in 1930. Some of these words have undergone semantic shift and are not great to say anymore, but I appreciate everyone's patience. There's some great stuff going on in here. I'm interested to see what continues to happen. You want a broader disclaimer? Check the show notes. Seizing one of the invisible forms, he lifted it and flung it, crashing to the ground. Another, and likewise another. Then he threshed his legs where two of the creatures clung, trying to drag him down again. They flew through the air with cries of fright. So far so good. We will all wait to see if there are any more. Come on, let's go. Right. Reaching for each other's hands, they raced down the slope. Halfway there, they saw a warning blast of steam rise from the engine, followed by a whistle. They'll be pulling out any minute now. We've got to make it. They're our only chance. We will make it, she sobbed through clenched teeth, meeting his pace. Glancing over his shoulder after another 15 seconds, Kendrick saw the disc was no longer visible. Since there was no vibration, he realized with relief it was now hidden behind the slope they were descending. Quick, push your button. They came out of the influence of the invisibility rays, raced breathless on down the slope, gained the station platform just as the train was getting underway. Helping the exhausted girl aboard, he mounted the steps himself, led her through the vestibule into its single-passenger coach. And dropping into a seat, they sat there panting as the train gathered speed. By the time the decrepit but life-saving little local drew into Gila Bend, they'd somewhat recovered from their harrowing experience. Marjorie was still pale, however, as Kendrick helped her from the train. I may recover, but I'll never look the same. An old saying, but now I know what it means. He thought better of a sudden impulse to tell her she looked quite all right to him. Instead, he said grimly, I now know what a lot of things mean. The Tucson Limited wouldn't be through for over an hour, they learned. That'd give them time to hunt up the authorities and sound a warning of the ominous invader that was in the vicinity. Perhaps by prompt military action it'd be destroyed or at least crippled. But first they went to the telegraph office, where Marjorie got off a message that would bring joy to her grieved family. While standing there, outside the barred window, odors of food wafted to them from a nearby lunchroom. That smells so good to me. Haven't tasted any earthly cooking for ages. Everything on that horrible disc was synthetic. I suggest we got ham and eggs at once. Or would you prefer steak? I think I'll have both. As they walked into the lunchroom, Kendrick told her of the banquet in his honor Cord promised for that night. Guess I didn't miss much. You certainly didn't. Would have opened with a puree of split molecule soup, continued with an entree of breaded electrons, and closed with an ionic cafe. He laughed at this. Just as well satisfied I was unable to attend. Humble as it is, I think this will prove to be much more wholesome food. Night had fallen by the time they left the lunchroom. Glancing at his watch, Kendrick saw they still had better than a half hour before the Limited was due, so they betook themselves to the police station. It was only a block away, and in consequence they weren't long reaching it.
The chief had gone home, the officer at the desk informed them, but if there was anything they cared to report, he'd be glad to make note of it. A big, raw-boned Westerner, he shifted his quid as he spoke and spat resoundingly in a cuspidor at his feet. Ah, all right then, get your pencil ready. This is Miss Marjorie Blake, daughter of Henderson Blake of New York. Perhaps you read of her disappearance a few weeks ago, and I... As he introduced himself and told briefly of their astounding experience, the officer's eyes bulged with amazement. Say, what are y'all trying to hand me? Do you think I was born simple? Press your button. Show him how invisibility ray works. It'll save a lot of argument. Right. He held up his wrist. See this? Now watch. He pressed the button, but to their dismay, nothing happened. All right, I'm still watching. Who's loony now? Kendrick examined the mechanism in impatience, pressed the little button repeatedly, but nothing happened. Try yours. She did so, with similar results, or lack of them, however. Something's wrong. The ray isn't working. Wrong is right, declared the officer, with a contemptuous flood of tobacco juice. You folks better go catch your train before you forget where it is. Chagrined, embarrassed, they took their leave, headed back toward the railroad station. Of all the utterly silly things, why do you suppose it didn't work? Kendrick didn't reply at once. When he did, his voice was grave. As the disc is gone. We're outside its zone of influence. Well, that's my hunch, at least. I think we'd better act on it. You mean? I think our escape has probably caused them to hurry their plans up a bit. Probably over New York right at the moment. Think we better get there the quickest possible way. The result was that when the train came, they remained on it only to Tucson. There they chartered a fast plane and started east at once. At sunset the following day, the plane swooped out of the sky and slid to rest on the broad grounds of the Blake estate at Great Neck. As Kendrick stepped from the cabin and helped Marjorie down, a tall, distinguished-looking man with graying hair and close-cropped mustache came hurrying toward them. Daddy, oh Daddy, she cried, rushing into his arms. Even without this demonstration, Kendrick would have recognized Henderson Blake from the pictures he'd seen recently in the papers. Now that he was introduced, Blake was gripping his hand warmly. Well, I don't quite know what this is all about, Professor. Marjorie's telegram last night was as cryptic as it was overjoying, but I do know that I owe you a deep debt of gratitude. Yes, and you owe our pilot about $1,000, too, put in the daughter of the house, clinging to her father's arm. Please give him a check, and then we'll go inside and I'll explain all about it. A matter much easier dispatched than my debt to Professor Kendrick. A matter much more easily dispatched than my debt to Professor Kendrick. The check was for $2,000, not $1. The pilot saw when he received it. Thank you very much, sir. Don't mention it. Good night, and good luck to you. The pilot returned to his plane. It lifted from the lawn and droned off into the twilight. Then they approached the cool white villa that stood invitingly 100 yards or so away beyond sunken gardens. As they neared it, a handsome, well-preserved woman whose face reflected Marjorie's own beauty came toward them. Lines of suffering were still evident around her sensitive mouth, but her dark eyes were still radiant. Mother, my poor darling. They rushed into each other's arms, clung, sobbing and laughing. Kendrick was glad when these intimate greetings were over and he'd met Miss Blake. They were in the drawing room now, listening to a somewhat more lucid account of their daughter's experiences and those of her rescuer. Marjorie was doing most of the talking, but every now and again she would turn to Kendrick for verification. Heavens, can such things be possible? Almost anything seems possible nowadays, my dear. And you say, Professor, that you've brought back samples of the invisibility device? Yes, we have, but I can't promise they'll work. I'll try, however. Whereupon, skeptically, he pressed that little square button and instantly faded out of sight. Good Lord, that proves it, why this is positively... His remarks were cut short by a scream of terror from his wife. Marjorie! Marjorie! Wheeling, he faced the chair where his daughter had sat. It was empty so far as human eyes could see.
Don't worry, Mother. Daddy, I'm quite all right. Coming back steady.
And back she came, as did Kendrick from the empty chair beside her. His face was grave. The success of their demonstration, which had proved their story to practical-minded Henderson Blake, had proved to him something altogether more significant. The disc, as he'd surmised, had rushed eastward immediately on learning of their escape, was now probably hovering right over New York.
Fabulous. Marvelous, even. But that heat ray, Professor, that sounds bad. You're convinced it's as powerful as they make out?
Positively.
That blast they let go in the desert would have utterly destroyed New York. Yes, no doubt you're right. I fully realize the fearful menace of this thing. Do you think the military authorities would be able to cope with it?
I don't know. Perhaps if they're prompt enough.
There's no other way? No scientific way of approaching things?
Kendrick grew thoughtful at this. I wonder. There's just a possibility, something running through my mind. An experiment I'd like to make if I had the facilities of some large electrical laboratory.
You shall have them tomorrow. I'm one of the directors of Consolidated Electric. Their experimental laboratory in Brooklyn is the finest of its kind in America. I'll see you have the run of it.
That'll be very kind, but don't expect anything to come from it necessarily. Just a theory I'd like to work out.
A butler entered at this moment and announced dinner. Well, theories are mighty these days, gleamed Blake as they rose, clapping the young man on the shoulder. You go ahead with your theories, and I'll bring a few facts to bear. Tomorrow noon I'll escort some military men and others of my friends over to the laboratory, hear and see some of this menace directly. Meanwhile, during this crisis, it'll honor me to have you as my guest. Our guest, amended Marjorie with a warm smile. Next morning, Blake motored Kendrick out to the Brooklyn laboratory of the Consolidated Electric Utilities Corporation and installed him there. Then he left, to return at noon with the promised delegation of generals, admirals, statesmen, and financiers. They were all frankly skeptical, though realizing Henderson Blake was not a man given to exaggeration, nor did their skepticism altogether vanish when Kendrick had ended his bizarre story with a demonstration of the invisibility device. Murmurs of amazement ran around the laboratory, it's true, but the more hard-headed of the spectators charged him with having invented the apparatus himself. Though they didn't come right out and say so, they seemed to imply that he was seeking publicity. Annoyedly, Kendrick tried to refute their charges, but even as he was summoning words, refutation utter and complete came from the air. A low, humming vibration sounded, grew in volume till it filled the room, and suddenly ceased, the light of midday fading to twilight. The disk, gasped Kendrick, rushing to the west windows. They followed, tense with awe, and there between Earth and the sun, its myriad towers and spires, refracting a weird radiance, hovered that vast flying city. My God, uttered a famous general, staring as though he'd seen a ghost. A great statesman opened his lips, but no word came. Appalling! Incredible! Burst from that of the stunned assemblage. Their comments were cut short by a broadcast voice, thin and clear, tremendously amplified, a voice that Kendrick recognized at once as that of Kor.
People of America, we of the planet Vada have come to conquer your country. You'll be given 48 hours to lay down your arms. If complete surrender has not been made by high noon, 2 days from now, New York will be destroyed.
The voice ceased. The humming recommenced, waned in volume until it died away, and twilight returned once more to midday. Peering fixedly through the west windows of the laboratory, the little assemblage saw the disk swallowed up in the clear blue sky. Then they turned and faced one another gravely. Outside on the streets, confusion reigned. In newspaper plants, presses were whirling, telegraph and cable offices, keys were ticking. From radio towers, waves were speeding. Within an hour, the nation and the world knew of this planetary invader and its staggering ultimatum. Naturally, the government at Washington refused to meet these shameful terms. Military and naval forces were rushed to the threatened metropolis. The Atlantic fleet steamed up from Hampton Roads under forced drought,
and assembled in the outer harbor. Thousands of planes gathered at Mitchell Field and other nearby aerodromes. Oh yeah, I'll be able to finish this relatively quickly. But where was the enemy? He must be miles up in space, Kendrick knew, as he toiled feverishly in the laboratory over his experiment after a sleepless night. For had that flying city been nearer Earth, it could not have maintained invisibility without that peculiar humming vibration. Scout planes, urged on by impatient squadron commanders, climbed till they reached their ceilings, searching in vain. They could encounter nothing, see nothing of the invader. Thus passed a morning of growing tension. But by noon of that day, with a bare 24 hours left before the expiration of the ultimatum, the disk came down, showed itself bodily. There followed stunning disaster. One salvo and the ray shot down. The Atlantic fleet, the pride of America, burst and melted in flaming hell. Squadrons of planes carrying tons of bombs frizzled like moths in the air. Mighty projectiles hurled by land batteries were deflected off on wild trajectories. Appalled, the nation and the world followed in lurid extras these crushing defeats. By nightfall of that day, all seemed lost. All opposition had been obliterated. America must capitulate or perish. It had until the next noon to decide which. Meanwhile, in that great Brooklyn laboratory, Kendrick was working against time, besieged by frantic delegations of the nation's leaders. They knew now that their one hope lay in him. Was he succeeding? Was there even any hope? Face haggard, eyes bloodshot from the lack of sleep, he waved them away, went on with his work. I'll tell you, as soon as I know. That's all he would say. Followed a night that was the blackest in all history, though the myriad stars of heaven shone tauntingly brilliant in the summer sky. At length dawn broke. Kendrick paused in his labors. There, he said grimly, surveying an apparatus that seemed to involve the entire facilities of the laboratory. It's done. Now, then, will it work? The delegation were called to witness the test. Henderson Blake was among them, as was Marjorie. She stepped forward as he prepared to make the demonstration. I know you're going to be successful, she murmured, pressing his hand and meeting his eyes with a smile of confidence. I hope you're right, Marjorie, he replied, letting slip the last word almost unconsciously. Her face colored warmly as they stepped back and rejoined her father. Kendrick's heart was beating fast as he turned to his instruments. How could he fail with fate like that behind him? Love, even, perhaps. No, he mustn't fail, nor would he, if his theory was sound. Addressing the assemblage, he explained briefly the complicated apparatus. These towers, he said, pointing to 4 steel structures about 10 feet high, arranged at the corners of a square, roughly 20 feet across, are miniature radio masts. The area enclosed by them, we'll assume, is the city of New York. The metal disc suspended above the area represents the invader, contains a miniature heat generator such as I was experimenting with recently in the Arizona desert. He paused and threw a switch. Somewhere in the laboratory, a dynamo began to whir. I'm now sending electromagnetic waves from the 4 towers, but instead of broadcasting them in every direction, I'm bending them in concave cathode of force over the city. You might picture this cathode as an invisible shield if you choose, but it's more than that. It's a reflector. If my theories are right, the radio-energetic ray I'm about to project upon it from my miniature disc will be flung back to its source as though it's been a ray of light falling on a mirror. Success of the experiment depends on what the result will be. Kendrick ceased and moved toward a rheostat. As he made ready to touch it, a breathless tension settled upon the assemblage. Upon the outcome of what was now to happen rested the fate of America, perhaps even the world. Calmly, though every fiber of his being was at breaking stress, the young scientist opened the rheostat. For an instant the ray seared down. Then, as it boomeranged back, the disc burst into flame, dissolved and disintegrated. A thin dust like carbon slowly settled to the lab floor. Cutting off the current from the radio towers, Kendrick faced them, a light of triumph in his tired eyes. You see? It works. They saw. Beyond a doubt it worked. and what Kendrick saw as his eyes met Marjorie's made him forget his fatigue. The rest was a mad scramble of preparation. Only a few brief hours remained, and much was to be done. The application of the principle that had just been demonstrated involved a hookup from the Consolidated Electric Lab with every broadcasting station in the metropolitan area, power being supplied by commandeering every generating plant within a radius of 50 miles. The city, moreover, had to be evacuated of all but the few brave hundreds who volunteered to stand by their posts at radio stations and generating plants. As for Kendrick, well, it was the busiest, most hectic morning he'd ever experienced. Only the realization of a girl's love and a nation's trust enabled him to overcome the exhaustion of 2 sleepless nights. At length, a little before 11, all was in readiness. Just 2 questions troubled the young scientist's mind. Had the people of the disk learned of their preparations to counter the attack? And would the improvised broadcasting apparatus of the area stand the stupendous strain that would be placed upon it if the ray came down? The first of these questions was answered staggeringly at 11:15. "Kendrick, oh my God, Marjorie, they've got her again!" cried Blake, bursting into the lab. "Look, read this!" He thrust out a piece of paper. Kendrick took it and read, "Your daughter will be my queen after this noon." "Where'd you get that?" "One of the invisible devils thrust it into my hand right out in the street not 5 minutes ago," Blake explained, trembling with anguish. "Do you realize what this means, Kendrick? She's on the disk now, in a scant 3/4 of an hour." "Yes, I realize. And I realize, too, that they don't know their fate. They'll stay. There's 45 minutes yet. We can't abandon our defense against the ray, not even for Marjorie, but I'll go. I'll rescue her. Or at least die with her." And even as Blake mutely reached out his hand to grip that of the determined young man who stood before him, Kendrick touched his wrist mechanism and became invisible. Once on the street, he pressed the escalator button as well, and by the strength of the vibrations that followed, he knew he must be very close within that mysterious lifting zone. Running west a block, he found it growing stronger. Fairly racing now, he continued on toward the river, progress unhampered in the deserted streets. Suddenly, with a thrill of exultation, he felt himself swept up, whirled away toward that great shimmering hulk against the sun. All right, library, come on. Library has joined us. Feel free to spam your little library emotes in chat. And if you don't have library emotes, well, need I remind you, you can activate your Prime sub that is free, and you get one a month, and you could acquire such lovely emotes as one that depicts our sweet beloved furry co-host, Library Cat. What hope was he thinking? What possible hope? And the answer came. Core. Reaching the disk, he switched out the escalator influence and hastened across the city to that monumental structure of jade green stone. The mighty little dwarf would be up there, in his glittering mosaic apartment, or in his pinnacle laboratory, perhaps, ready to pull the lever that would release that stupendous blast of heat. Gaining the jeweled door of the monarch's quarters, at last, after escaping detection by a hair's breadth more than once, he pressed the button outside, just as the guard had done that first time. In response, the door opened, and there stood Core. He stood there an instant, that is, while the expression on his leathery face went from inquiry to alarm. Then, as Kendrick burst into the room and shut the door, he went invisible. In that same instant, the young scientist's eyes beheld a sight that caused his heart to leap. There sat Marjorie, bound in a chair, an expression half of hope, half of dejection on her face. It's Gordon. Take courage." "It's I, Gordon. Take courage."
"Oh, I so prayed you'd come, and you came,"
she murmured as her face lighted. Then tensely she added, "The door, look out!" Kendrick wheeled just in time. The door was opening. "Not so fast!" His hands gripped the dwarf, yanked him back, throttled him before he could emit a cry, and pushed the door shut. Core struggled like a madman, but it was futile. Kendrick's hands cut into his throat like a vice. After a moment or two, he gasped and relaxed. Releasing his grip then, Kendrick felt for his wrist, stripped off his bracelet, whereupon the dwarf became visible. His face was putty white. He was either dead or unconscious. Restoring his own visibility then, he advanced to Marjorie, swiftly freed her. "Take this," he said, handing her Cora's bracelet. She slipped it on. "Now let's tie him and get out of here. He might be dead, but we can't take any chances on that." The dwarf wasn't dead, however, for he groaned and opened his eyes as they lifted him into the chair.
You win, Professor, but it avails you nothing. My capture, my death even, will not prevent the ray. The orders have been given. It will be projected sharp at 12. You go but to your doom.
"That's a matter of opinion." Swiftly they bound him and gagged him.
And now we wish you good day, and such fate as you deserve.
Then turning to Marjorie,
Your hand again.
or wait, that's Kendrick rather. "And now we wish you good day, and such fate as you deserve. Your hand again, if you would." There was a new tenderness in its soft warmth that thrilled him. They touched their buttons and went invisible. Silently then they stole from the apartment. Swiftly they made their way down to the concourse, raced across the city to the Amber Court, descended to the trap door. Must be nearly 12, Kendrick knew. He couldn't look at his watch, for it, as well as himself, was invisible. Indeed, even as they stood there, poised for the plunge, a faint whistle rose from below. Marjorie trembled. "Steady. Some of them always blow a minute or two before. You ready?" "Yes." "Then push your button and jump." Even as they leapt, the sickening thought came that perhaps the escalator ray was no longer running. But the fear was unwarranted. They were caught up, whirled gently downward. Moving along laterally as they descended, they were able to land without difficulty in the middle of a deserted street near the Consolidated Electric Laboratory. "Thank heaven," she sighed as their feet touched solid ground. They pressed off both buttons, becoming visible once more. "Echo, so let's—" But Kendrick never completed that sentence, for now whistles all over the metropolitan area, rising from the generating plants, announced the ominous hour. It was high noon. The ultimatum had expired. Lifting tense faces to the disk, they waited. That stupendous ray be hurled back upon itself, or would it sear through their makeshift defense, plunging them and the whole great metropolis into oblivion? Suddenly, cataclysmically, the answer came. There burst a withering whirlwind from the disk. It struck the mighty concave cathode of interlaced waves above the city. There followed an instant's clash of titanic forces. Then the cathode triumphed and hurled it back. Rocked by concussion as of two worlds in impact, blinded by a glare that made the sunlight seem feeble in comparison, Marjorie and Kendrick clung together while the disk grew into a satellite of calcium fire in the sky. Presently, as the conflagration waned, they opened their eyes. Gravely, but with deep thanksgiving, they searched each other's faces. In them they read deep understanding, too, and a new hope. "I think we'd better go and find Father." "I think so, too." As they headed toward the laboratory, a fine, powdery dust like volcanic ash was falling. It continued to fall until the city streets were covered to a depth of an inch or more. Thus passed the menace of VOD. Okay, gang. As much as I would love to dig into the reader's corner and read some of these letters, I am rapidly running out of voice to speak with, so I think I'm going to need to call it an evening there. One last plug for everything. Friendly reminder to the podcast listener that not only is the Discord linked in the show notes, but there is also a link to the Twitch channel on which this was streamed live. So it is entirely feasible for you to turn up Friday evenings, 8 p.m. Central, or 8 p.m. Not Central anymore, 8 p.m. Pacific. That would be 10 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Eastern, if I'm doing my math correctly. There will be a correct timestamp in this episode and this episode only. But Friday evenings is the best time The Discord, one of the links mentioned that'll be in the show notes, will be of particular use there. I announce every stream that goes up there, um, alongside a great volume of other content that I do exclusively for Discord. What else is in the show notes? Oh, a link to the stories we've just been reading, as this is a public domain work that's easily accessible. It acts as an Erstats transcript. I believe that's all three links in the show notes. There's also an expanded disclaimer that I had mentioned in short previously. Yeah, I would say that's about it. So, as usual, this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.